Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Murasaki in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. A Tale of Misfits, Part 2. Sing bring thring summer slipped into torpor, yawned. Autumn was waking. Hands over eyes, she peeked through, saw yellow in the skies. It did not hurt, a seclusion from sun was coming. At night, thrum of bells increased, and clothed in rain's raiment, the temple was noisy. Rains were strong this summer, and runoff that came down the mountains choked up the catchments. They all rode out, trudging across sludge-filled canals, to meet monks at sturdy gates. A gold sheen existed about the bricked walls, and harsh clothing, dirt encrusted and filthy, snuck into the portraiture of this coarse village. Where it rained, it always rained. Soil slaked its thrust, rain kept coming, earth had not a choice but to regurgitate water and mud for the animals. When much of it came back out, it flooded streets, turned everything brown. Wherever they looked, russet glared. Relief was stark on withered features when clouds would break open, and sky sunned over and expanded across flooded plains and beyond. Flowers grew and nature sighed content again, for this was a rare blessing, yet the poor set out to seek fires, plains where forests thrived and streams flowed from mountains tall and kind. Its winds, swinged by summer, gathered the rich flora's scents that typified the craggy landscape that surrounded Leaf. There on the edge of Fire Country's village stood Yoshiwara, field of rushes, a liminal space between rain's gloom and Leaf's bloom. Clouds hung deep upon rivers and vales, enveloped rain. They always did. She liked it here on the side of Leaf, where purple dots brightened the dismal place. Rushes tossed about in wind that was sweetened like candies, syrupy sweet, by nature's empurpled children. Yoshiwara was a big quarter, spread about on nearly 12 acres of land, surrounded by tall walls. Beyond the walls, moat encircled it on 3 sides and a river's vein on one, a fissure in the land that cracked open into a full rupture as it moved away towards the mountains where sun fell amongst summer's boughs. Trees that bore flora and fruit bright competed with rushes, weeds, vines that flourished in a more temperate weather. Sun and wind were kind to all, and she was poor and wanted fire's breeze to embrace her, too. Leaf's academy had rejected her. The council's parochial attitudes did not make things easy. They said that her training was insufficient to continue on into the military. The sack on her bag was heavy, soaking in summer's rain that was more pleasant than rains. She stood on the threshold again, her visage all weariness and curious. Beyond the walls lay rain, still murky. Rains never stopped. By her feet a lily danced in joy. It had eaten up the chakra of the flowers that clustered about, their withered petals had fallen off and floated away, to places unknown. Even before she released a long breath, her heart was made. She entered through the front gate on the east side, at the end of a long bridge. Lights fringed quarters, red, yellow, blue like flowers. The insides, like creamy lilies, flushed with colors, songs, and sighs they outpoured onto the 3 parallel streets. These intersected a central thoroughfare and were divided into 5 sections. They called it Gakko. Bordellos, tea houses, shops stood on both sides of the streets, colored in the air that breasted hostility from shades. It was teeming with people. Through the tsubone's lattice that sent forth shadow on the bosom of a bird, frozen in an alcove, an air most stale in the compartment, she saw women. There, in the room, circumscribed by fiat and dimness, posed tsubone, nude or draped in loose hanging garments. Their breasts, ample and ripe, mouths, rouged and tight. They smiled, laughter trilling, that poured forth from the gaps like loosened tides. Men lay supine, and they bent over them, mouths encircling stiff organs. Their muscles knotted, expression strained, and they erupted their filth into their orifices. This was strange. She was still thinking when a proprietor found her, a haggard man in good clothes. He took her to a room full of ornamental things that shone like fingerlings in the stream that ran behind her house, and she told him of her desire to stay here and earn a living. The woman beside him, a mean old crone, said that she was too unsightly to be kept in the Sancha quarters, that she was well suited for no more than a hashi's living. It angered her, yet she did not say anything to the woman but to the man that she was with virtue, her chastity intact. The man looked and asked of her to disrobe, and she did. When the slack garment, made of coarse cotton, slipped away, it revealed the body of a budding girl of 11, who was a month shy of 12. Her complexion was ruddy, a rubor about cheeks, created from the close clustering of vivid freckles. Her countenance, rather hollow from hunger, had not been enhanced by the harshly cut crimson coiffure, though her lips, offered above a clean and small chin, were pretty. Her body, thin and elongated, without a robust hue, shoulders small and compressed, ribs rested closely underneath the taut skin. Her breasts, too small for a man to be enchanted, but her hips, wide, bowl-like. She could tell that he was not fully unimpressed. He asked her to come closer into the lights and spread out her thighs, and when she did, his hand went up between quaking swells tight as ropes, and he stuck a finger up into her channel. The intrusion caused her walls to close in around his digit. It burnt. He hummed, smiling. She was young, still blooming, tight, worth something, at least. He told her that she was good enough to be made at Tsubone, for now, that their main proprietor, a former Teu, would decide her fate upon her return from leave. She smiled, cheeks dimpling. Fire country repelled rains indeed. World spun and went on outside. Men destroyed thatched houses and erected houses of plank boards along the streets. No and kabuki stages flourished on the side streets and offered dance and music for old and young, priest and shinobi alike. They came here in large crowds to watch temple and shrine dances, spider dance, lion dance, joruri, and many more. Inside, now 12 after bleeding, she put on her own nightly performance. On the pretext of seeing these gaudy shows, men, ruffian, and monk, rutted in the quarters. Her first customer was a clumsy young man of 14, a priest. He had come on a boat to watch the kabuki dance, but he realized that a thief had run away with his gold. Left with only 30 mom, he had no choice but to settle for it Tsubone, though he was happy that he was her first. Her proprietor charged extra and asked him to be careful, for she was delicate and nervous. He sat down by the lantern, a tall fellow, his head shining like polished stone. She knew men enjoyed being taken into the mouth. Deeply hungered, she had serviced military serving shinobi with her mouth for 5 mom, sometimes less, from a tender age of 7. The trick was to treat the organ gently than masticating food, like bolus, only bigger and weeping at head. If it was suckled, like an infant suckling at teat, it flowed easily, and they came in wars to reign, unfeeling and heartless. It was best to entice them, not draw their ire. When he loosened his organ from his layered garment's trappings, after undoing his prayer ropes, it was still rising and twitching, beating at the head, its hue shy. She chose to encourage it, for she found it to be a convenient size for being taken into the mouth. Slipping it between her lips, she retained it into the mouth, brought it under the action of teeth and tongue, all the while she pleasured the swelling lips between her thighs, grew moist and slimy. He grew a little harder, longer, thicker, but not enough to cause her discomfort. Then she backed away, lay down in a band of light, spoke scarce a word to him. He lay on top, weight on his elbows and forearms, planted on either side of her head. Still she felt pinned down beneath his bulk. Whilst he undid her robe from the front and opened it, he left it on, as though to confirm her nakedness. He lowered his head on the shoulder, rested it there, and unfastened his flowing sun-yellow trousers and slowly rolled them down to his thighs, and then he was clueless whilst he stabbed his impatient and ripened organ here and there at the region where her spread thighs joined together with her genitals, unable to locate her channel. True to his profession, he was more virgin than she. Taking his penis firmly, she moved down a bit and pulled it downwards till it touched and parted her lips. A little breathless, he sank into her clamping channel, slurring about kami and what not. She did not bleed, she had prepared herself well, and though he was not gentle, he was not harsh, either. His thrusts long, quick, and erratic, his back clammy, contracting under her palms. She felt full with him, feeling friction, and stranger things. Her little body shook, strands of sweat flying off and winding down around the balls of her shoulders, muscles of her limbs, and at the top of her pink-crested breasts. His hand moved and grasped at her breast, almost pulling it out of her flesh. She was quite small at the top, almost flat. Lights broke away from fireworks and set upon them in darkness, and he kept grunting, pumping his hips in madness to quench his need. Untired, she had only begun to taste a mechanism called pleasure, and he burst open at the tip and filled up her channel and womb. A warm wetness spread into her belly, and when he pulled out, it spread outwards as though an organ was cut open and its coagulating blood was distributed on her thighs. His ejaculation was warm, his organ dripped, thickly glazed. Thankfully, he did not ask of her to take him into her mouth again. He paid her a little extra 5 mom for her oral technique. She hid away the money, smiled that she would be out of here soon. Yet months passed by in waiting. Men came and went, but she could not say no, she did not have the luxury. She sat atop fat ones, squeezed her channel, and they gushed faster. They fled after playing old fuddy-duddies. When sky changed and took upon rain's gloom in winter, she went to the woman who ran this place. She stood by her door, hearing her speak to a man in a desperate and angry tongue. I loved the innocence in your face, your eyes. Now, you sit around, sour-faced, as though you have smelled a fat man's shit-smeared robes, she spoke, her voice influenced by ire. Your language is unnecessarily foul, spoke he, in a voice that was wintry, unchanging. I am more cultured in speech than you could ever be, spoke she, her voice whispering. Lovely. The glimpse into your culture is inspiring. Oh, your imagination and tongue run wild today, humor me, spoke she, laughing. I have done much for you. Do something for me, too. Silence. The man said nothing. She watched their shadows on the paper screen, one tall and lithe and the other less tall and shapely. Wind spoke once, and she heard her speak again, her tone diminishing from emotions. Why do you not keep me as your mistress? The man did not speak a word for a moment, which must have felt longer to the woman that awaited his words. The council will not allow it. And you? She asked, her tone quick, hurt. He said nothing, and she spoke, voice wounded, delicate. You think me dirty, darling? And what of you? You expel your filth in me, what does that make you? Dirty. She pushed him back in anger, yet he did not lose his balance, black figures moving in paper white. He stepped back, watching. Why do you quarrel with me? If this arrangement displeases you, I can stop coming, he spoke, his words too honest. Ah, and now you hold me by the neck, knowing that I love you, that I cannot live without you, you cruel boy. Leave, get out. She shouted, and she heard a clatter of ink bottles, and not a moment later, a man left her room, his gait unaffected by her words, arms white as snow, hair resting on his back like a vertical brush stroke against the white flak jacket. She could not see his face. Too curious, she stepped inside and saw the woman. Upon herself, she wore a color that mocked higanbana, and her lips mocked it more. Her eyes sparkled like fish in Tsukuyomi's reflection, her face crafted after her mother offered up her orison to Kami, hair parted in negligent simplicity over her brow. Oh, she was beautiful, a dream, tendered of winter's heart, redder than red sasanqua, face teased by moon's visions, most careless, not kisses, lovely in the white light. Hanakoto. And when she looked upon her, heard her name, Karen, on her lips, she was arrested by her gaze. Karen bowed, told Hanakoto of her woes in rain, and she was most understanding. She offered Karen's sake in a compartment in Sancha quarters, said she was pretty and kind. Karen was overjoyed, and 2 years blinked away under twinkling skies, and in seasons and storms, they stayed longer whilst their child matured, nurtured him more. Men built more houses by cutting off rushes. From her window, they scattered about like crabs and stood polished, brown mounds amidst the marsh of rushes. And one autumn, a man came by in night when storm illumined Yoshiwara's walls and waters outside. He was strange, of sickly white, eyes slit-like, tongue long. He hissed, not spoke. He was snake-like a snake. He asked of her if she was a pure Uzumaki, and she told him that she was pure-blooded from her mother's and father's side. Then, without laying with her, he offered to take her from this place, to pay her debt in full. A rush of blood to the head, she said, yes, and marched out into the willows and hazels of leaf, never to be the same again. He walked in the rain-dressed forest, illuminated rainy realms that guided his way. The land went down, and there lay another forest that hid away the men he had come to kill. It was easy business, and his was a history told in mud and rains and hands water, blue waters as far as the eye could see. When lands forgot her children, it bequeathed love to rejection, life to death. His people died, so did his kin. Alas, life went on, so did his. In rains, rains, more rains. His jargon had been hard to conceal, his teeth chomped away on it with brutality, words rolled off his tongue like water off plates, and, often, he burned his R's in his Hojiki accent, though he had learned to soften his tongue amongst foreign men. Many did not enjoy his speech, he could tell. He remembered his mother's face when he set out, hatchet-like, blue in the hollows of her eyes, seams of her nose and mouth. She had lost the swarthy hue he likened to honey in the last few years old and battered. She lumbered in the house, tormented him by speaking of his dead brother, father. They were gone, she could not understand a metal crone. He went ahead and saw mounds, black as hard dirt, in the clearing. They had built canals into the ground after cutting off trees, in the manner of crabs that dig up deep holes round their bodies. He did not understand the young Uchiha man, in line to become the head. What did he want with these fools? He was unhappy, displeased with their audacity to stop Leaf's water after the treaty signing. A negotiation and some gold would have made these men happy, but he wanted to teach the thugs a lesson of a lifetime. Rain came, he went. After a hard day at work, they slept in dusk's last glories, their beds dry as summer's reeds. They never saw his blade descend, he was fast like that. One clean downward movement rent them up in two. His steel tore up the guts, crushed spines into splinters. Grunts, just grunts, and they bled out quick on the ground made from smoothed mud. Red spread out on hazel brown, spots of it decorated walls like flowers, turning black as it went into mud. His blade made things messy, but no one had ever survived its edge. He stepped out, dripping in red and rain, yet won out, and he forgot their pain. They lay dead in the hut, torn through, mauled by Leaf's savagery. If it were not him, another would have ripped through them, unminding of their plight. He made peace with that, for he was poor, and they, unlucky. He reached Leaf's border, not delighted to find him standing, white in shadow. He gave him gold, never forgetting his promise, and the smell of it made him turn greedier. Though the metal was cold between his fingers, it had a sweet smell, one that pulled in desires on a boy's dreams. He felt that they fled from him into ether's spread, never to be seen again, but his gold awoke in him a taste of things to come, and he wanted more from life, too. The young Uchiha smiled, beautiful like moon, amused by his desperation, yet he did not speak. Silent like dreams, he that was shadow became shadow in the forest's night, and he could not help but like the weight of gold in his hands, his heart's joy expanding beyond his control, murdered men forgotten. In winter, he returned back to his house that was empty and falling in a quiet that was disquieting. Dust had disappeared behind white, and droplets hung like stars from the shingled roof, and mist afloat on things he left behind, brushed by winter's disinterest, almost solidifying. A man told him to find her by the tree on the hill off yonder. He remembered seeing one there, tall and crooked against full moons. When he was a child, its broken shadow sneaked into his room, spread its limbs wide out, and terrified him. That was a long time ago, for even fears located burrows to hide inside till they were forgotten. Rain was deep white, chaste like maidens, it was snowing, ground a garment for virtue. His feet sank in, graying footfalls, eyes taking in purple dots that stood shining in winter's bosom. Earth had risen by the foot of the terror-inviting tree that leant over it, bowing without sun in sight. Surprised, he looked at the mound, his soft purple eyes moist centers in the light choked by winter that went down into the eyes' hollows, across the nose's bridge, along the thinning lips' curve. Then surprise changed blood would have frozen if not for the warmth from his heart. His eyes had gone paler with grief's touch, starred with bristly lashes and dots of ice. Then he grimaced and sank down into the snow that slid away from his body, hands on the tree that was less frightening than his boyhood memories. "Yeah, bitch." He choked out, eyes raining without rain, "Yeah, stupid bitch." Then his back bowed, purple a haze in his closing eyes. They said that they hoisted this savage up from the belly of some rust-eaten boat. He was quiet, yet that was not always true. From weepy to angry, he became sentimental rather quickly during forlorn, dreadful, wet days. They called him a madman from caves. He did not care. Their words meant little. When passion wrecked his soul in envy, he did not see friend or foe, he brutalized all into bits, pieces, guts. He created carnage in the prison. The man who held him behind seal-coated bars feared his metamorphosis, but he feared his constitution more. He wanted to sell him off to a village in fire, said that he would bring him good money. Yet he preferred to sit in the dark. Idle hands were a devil's worship, idle mind, its playground. He chose neither. He prayed and prostrated before light, dreaming of Kami who would come unto him someday. He set his mind on birds that came from the window trilling in his ears their songs. They loved him, and he them. In madness which attacked him, he wanted the world to be wet with blood, and being flushed with youth made the passion easy. His heart was cooled by their innocence, their love-filled songs. Yet one man stole his bird and twisted its wing and made it cry out. It kicked up his sleeping fury, whereupon his body altered its state, a grotesque enlargement of face, limbs, body. Veins fell away, blood thrilled to the lash. He was freed. The brute thought that the prison kept him safe, but he was a fool. He broke away from walls, broke into his body, wadded up clods of dirt and gut into his mouth. This place dark vulgarised it, storm freed it. Flashes, only flashes, lashed dark's back and abuse glared white upon its flesh. At last, his heart cooled, and he picked up the bird and went back to the broken prison, his hands cradling the creature whilst it writhed and jumped. He kissed it. Come morning, another prison keeper appeared. He was young, beautiful, white like Kami. His hair, winter's blessing, and, upon his brow, 2 red dots existed, like eyes supreme. He said that he was Kimimaro, he told him that he was Yugo. He took from him the injured bird and made it well by his bones. He sat behind the bars, his grip becoming a clutch, storm-battered knot of teeth hemmed in by a rough mouth. Yugo told him that he was never abundant with friends, and Kimimaro told him that he should not forget the recitation of his victims. Had Kimimaro mocked him of his killings? He could not say, for he was a little boy and he loved the divinity in him. Kami lumbered around with dirty work and tended the lantern and prison himself, and Yugo watched him like a priest crazed whilst he braced for storms outside. When Kami talked, he listened. He would let him outside prison, and Yugo would sit down by his feet, grasp at his hips, bury his face into his belly, and weep as though he was a mother he never had. Then Kami would laugh, and love would spread out across his cheeks, like autumn nights calling. Radiant his beauty, divine his love which had but spread coil by coil into his being. He had never loved before, never. And it had gripped him, stolen his soul, swollen his spirit. And years went by under Kami's gaze, and he grew, yet his love stayed the same, pure like autumn, still like winter. Yugo, lost boy from caves, he never wanted to part from Kami's bosom, his grace, but love, like all things, did not last. Like animals unbound, they came, men from Shadow Village, and they raised swords and struck down the young Kami he loved. He showed them no mercy. A hero in his tale, he slaughtered, not leaving the child genin amongst them. Yugo tore open his mouth with claws unfeeling. Then he sat down, picked up the staring Kami, dug his maw deep into his heart and he ate it, though he still wept, for Kami's heart had gone cold. Outside, he dug up his beloved's grave, claws on freezing cold. Winter had ruined him and his heart. Now, standing on the fulcrum of sanity, he looked upon Kami reborn who stood over him, sky burning overhead. Sun started down, and Kami bedecked himself with hues furious. In this life, he had grown up in Fury's belly. Had he come to avenge his previous death? Oh, joy! Funny, some would say, his eyeshade was a curse, but it was true just the same that his love for this divinity was a curse, too. Mouth screaming inventory of guts, corpses stripped of flesh. This was his welcome to his beloved. You did not live once, but died twice. You came back to me, oh, Kami, he whispered, in the deepest love. A Tale of Misfits, Part 3. With Kami gone, the growing boy, Yugo, had no hope. Youth, spring in body, dallied with winter's urgency to end its lively traces. He resisted, for he was made to resist. He lingered in caves, darkness his tormentor, birds his companions, and to a child's imitation his body returned. Over and over again. In skies that released shades like man's natures, seasons came and went, yet he remained the same, unchanging. Hairs did not grow on his face, and, to the onlookers, he looked no older than a small but lanky boy. His hands, big and strong, learned to hold a chisel and granite, and, from his artistry, Kami appeared in stones and scrolls. He wept hard. His love, an ache that never slackened. He loved Kami, yet Kami haunted him. He wanted to submit, he did not know how. To call his beloved unto himself for tears, his missives of love, did little to sway Kami's heart. He prostrated in reins, clasped his hands together, prayed, yet Kami did not speak, did not hum. Kami's heart, which he had eaten to his fill, fell further than its beats. What did he do wrong? He let Kami die. Fool, fool. In his dreams, Kami would come, smile upon him from a place to where he could not run. Was his love not enough? He languished, for he was unclean for Kami's grace. He would have it, but a man's love was not as easy as lust. So he built a shrine in Kami's name, crafted his beauty from stones, filled the indentations in the brow with bits of blood, and Kami stood smiling before him now, trapped in stones, forever lovely for his eyes. Kami was silent still. And what he would not give to have Kami in their midst. His passion was nigh furious, his nature, curious. Like little boys. When his nature came to the fore, he forgot time and whispers, I'll make you mine. He loved to pray, he did not stray, for his love was a religion most divine. Kami, O Kami, love me the way you love all. And when he would look to Kami, imprisoned in stones, he would notice a little smile stay longer upon the bow of Kami's stone lips than shimmering lights, and he just knew that Kami loved his beloved, that Kami would come for him someday. Parting was uglier than his sins. Blasphemy, blasphemy. He would scream and birds would flutter in agony and Kami would smile, for he knew that Kami's heart beat for him, only no one else. Nothing would occupy his heart, but Kami's beauty, his duty. Now, he sat bowed in the light that was at its last flicker, but Kami's beauty was radiant in dancing dark that he could not help but allow his eyes to feast upon Kami till he wept blood in passion. This Kami was growing, and he could see a curiosity in him. Kami looked about, casting his gaze upon Yugo's little offerings. The man's raiment was that of a shinobi, and blood that had seeped from many grievous wounds flooded the stone slab. Unclean. Would Kami hate him, forgive him? But Kami smiled, and he smiled, too. And he let his eyes feast some more, as Kami had changed, his hair, from winter's duty to autumn's vengeance, spoke of his rebirth as though he had come from Yomi's blood pools, risen pure from its reds. By Kami's side, an altar stood, wreathed in mist. It was not bereft of holy adornments, no, he would never commit such an act of sacrilege. A body, pulverized by being thrown against the stones with great ferocity, lay on it. It had collapsed into a heap of misshapen bones inside flesh that was broken. From its mouth, a great tide of blood had come forth and flowed along the channels gouged in stones. Red as love apples, it had gone into Kami's rendition, contorted into a fountain. Weeping, he grabbed Kami's hands in his and kissed them and took him to a little shrine he had made for him in distress. Kami did not protest. The shrine stood cradling a trestle of tiny bones, and a shade of human skin topped the edifice. Then he knelt by Kami's feet and pressed his face into the young Kami's belly, wailing. His love had been a burden for so long, and Kami looked down, and he up, and Kami spoke and he heard his words, I'm your knife, and like white fish gutted inside out were his eyes, a baptismal font in which he would perish in love relentless. In the gloss of winter's morn, a stream ran dimpling from rain. The forest was quiet as the dead this season. The little Hojiki boy talked to the littlest Uchiha boy under the trees that had no shade to give as their foliage was gone. Twisted limbs cast their shadows on the boy's cheeks, but they were as pretty and white and rubescent as ever. The older one was quiet, his eyes on the village that stood behind a cloud of rain and fog. He could tell that the young Uchiha man had come here with a purpose, he saw it in his eyes. A great storm was brewing, but it was of no concern to the Hojiki boy who listened to the spirited Uchiha boy talk of a fish he wanted to catch for his nii-san. Rare ain't it, Lil Suzuki? He asked and scratched his head and stole a glance at the Uchiha man who was still looking, uninterested in the talk. Suzuki nodded, grabbing hold of Ataka's hand in his hands. It's a koi, a white one with 2 little red spots. He said and tapped his finger twice against his brow. Doyo want ta eat it? He asked and leant on his sword. No, Suzuki answered, his mouth twisting in a manner as though his suggestion was unthinkable. I want it for the stream. You want him to find a fish in the land of waves? That is a big place to search for a little fish, the older one, Itake, finally spoke and looked down at his sibling. He can do it. Suzuki looked up, a big smile on his lips. I saw a black one in the stream. Catch it before it swims away. Go on, Itaka spoke and Suzuki ran away. He looked at the little one busy in play for one more heartbeat before his eyes returned to the Hojiki boy. Suijutsu, was it? He spoke, his words lighter than waves. Did you do what I asked of you? I can't find Imare. Ya asking for something impossible. If he's gone, he won't be found. I think ya know that, too, he said and stepped back into the light and brushed off the dirt from his cloak. With effort, you can find God, Itaka spoke, a drunken redness winning over his eyes. I am saddened by your lack of passion. I am sad, too, he said and pulled his eyes away from the ferocity of Itaka's accursed sherry non. Your temptations should yield results, he spoke, looking upon Suijutsu in a manner as though he could see him all the way down to his bones. And the gold that jangled in his frayed pocket gold that shamed him. Suijutsu did not speak, bowed his head, hunched his shoulders. You came to me, he spoke, eyes furious as winter's deathly simplicity. I did not keep you to satisfy the child's wish. I hope you are not that simple. Kisame could ave gonta waves I don't know, Suijutsu said, his words tripping over each other like children in mud. It ain't that easy to find I'm. Folks come and go. Rain's always been like this. No one rats out one af their own air. I don't know what to tell ya. Am tryin'. Try a little harder. I have faith in you, he spoke and smiled and looked in the direction of the little boy standing ankle-deep in the stream that carried light in intermittent shimmers upon its waves. Suzuki, do not go far. Stay where I can see you. Nii-san look. Suzuki came running, a transparent bag in his hand in which a purple koi coiled. Oh, you found a better one. Itaka spoke and brushed hair from Suzuki's brow. Playing is good, but you have played all day long. I still want the white one, Suzuki said, a hue of love apples smearing his cheeks and lips, a love invading his voice like treacherous soldiers Itaka's leaf. Okasan loved it. Itaka looked at him for a moment in silence, his eyes gaining a color that was deeper than before. Suijutsu could tell that Itaka did not like the little one's love of the dead. He can look for the lost fish in waves, but he cannot make you a promise. Do you understand? Suzuki sighed out, his face falling in sorrow which robbed quite a bit of the lovely shade from his countenance, and pressed his brow against Itaka's belly. I will get you something better, lovelier, he spoke and lifted Suzuki up into his arms. Why do you doubt me? Tell me what you want, and I will bring it for you. Then he turned away from the Hojiki boy, and his words enticed rain's winds, and, when Suijutsu looked down, he noticed that Itaka had thrown away the bag onto the stones. Upon which the purple koi jumped and tossed and whipped in great agony. It was the pinnacle of autumn, nights colder than the coldest steel and snow, upon which moon writhed like fingerlings in unrest. This land was thinly sprinkled with weathered wooden houses that remained within the enclosure of trees, marked with funjutsu spells and robust flowers which grew tough and numerous from a soil hostile to most men. She wanted to tread deep into the forests, go where leaf twinkled with life anew lilies, more purple than the most purple habit Kami adorned, returned to the surface, especially giddy when the moon was full and beautiful, like boys they played, like perfumes they weighed upon air's tendrils, sweet. They made a nice trail towards leaf, chasing, seeking, hungering, and, about them, chakra breaths would dance in abandon. Her heart existed in rain, but, out here, lilies stole her spirit someday, she would be free. Now, she stayed with her master who was the strangest man, skin white like milk gone sour, only he did not smell, words hissed, not flowed, from his lips as though wrestling against the tongue's nature, eyes yellow like lights blinking in a fog-laden village. To her, he was a beast starved, snout buried in gristles others did not need, but he never touched her, no never with a need warming his flesh. She did not think he craved a thing from another. He touched to study as one would a desecrated corpse, he tasted to measure her blood's worth. On her body, his teeth marks existed as memories shallow not deep, purple not red, slow not quick that mapped nearly every inch of her. Over time, they healed and she was fresh and new. He told her that she was special, one of a kind, intelligent, soft-hearted, different. His words, languid and large, meant something to a little girl's heart. Where her sight failed, her heart grew with a girl's wish, for her master less man, more serpent was lonely, his abode, lonelier. By night, the house, which was as large as a row of tiny houses squished into one another back in rain, turned gloomy. Torches hung on walls, numerous and dim, their lights frail in the face of this place's dastardly adornments. The mechanism fixed to the floor was no more elaborate than a trapdoor, it needed a funjutsu seal to open, which she had taught him. "Our little secret," he would whisper, mouth smiling and lengthening to a degree that would have horrified every other child, but not her. She was tougher than that, as in the basement her master had caged men like animals fattened for slaughter. Pressed together, they heaved and moaned and reeked from them, urine and odor flowed, like rivers reckless after rains. When a man died and went still as a limp cock, he would imbue him with an unholy fire that made the limbs all twitchy and icky. He was a magician. She did not mind. Her master had a brilliant mind, and, in mortals, he sought immortality. Live forever. She had asked one night when a strange and curious quality hung in winter's air, and yellow radiated on the round of her cheek, for she was well fed and full of blood. He smiled and looked up from the letter written in a scrawling longhand, his letters looped in a tighter fashion, almost inorganic like he. Light gleamed on his visible teeth and went into his eyes faster than his knives did into men, though no blood could burst forth from the invisible wounds. "Would you not want to?" he asked, and his question perplexed the little girl. Then he went about his business, and she hers. It was winter and the house had to be kept warm as it turned into a tomb for all, save her master. In the back garden, he grew strange herbs, some even fed on blood and granted him the vitality he needed. "You're scary," she would sometimes say, and he would see her, not merely look, and give way to a laughter that lingered longer than leaves lashing night's unmoving air. The garden here, a rusted pump stood by the well that was dry as dead men's bones in winter, but, now that summer had come, it was rife with sweet-smelling fresh water. Excited, she would dunk a pot into the well, fill it up, carry it to the room where he worked away into the night. By night, when sky was blacker than her master's dilating pupils, contained in embers agony, he would drag out one weary prisoner, with the intention of studying him quite thoroughly. He cleared the table of all valuables to afford space, and she stood by him, elbows on the table, face propped in hands, looking at the veins gush out blood and splatter the floor like flowers would in spring, flowers that were not as pretty as purple lilies, no, never like lilies. With long blade knives, which he held with womanly grace, he prodded spent corpses and poked limbs that twisted at odd angles and pried open wounds that he himself had created the night before. Always looking, always searching, she did not know what he hoped to find in ruined men afflicted by death. After he was done, smiling at her, eyes shiny and glazed, he would throw the mess into the furnace that always burnt like the sage's magic trick and ask of her to pipe the steam into the generator room. It had to be kept up and running. "You do not want to freeze to death, do you?" he asked, appearing playful as though he was pretending to be a little boy, and she shook her head, thinking on the sensations one would feel without fire's warmth. That would be like when she was in rain from above, a cold wetness running down the limbs, soaking through, but only worse. She did not think too much on it. He was strange. A season passed away alongside Leaf's receding heat, and she grew a little taller, her cheeks losing a bit of childlike plumpness, yet gaining a ruddiness that was coming's youth's sign. As spring began its journey in her flesh, her master's winter blossomed on him more and more. He stood hunched, with limbs crooked, his sear flesh snared by veins weathered beyond repair. She could not understand his state. Nightly, daily, he coughed out blood and pus, but she was so accustomed to seeing seeping, leaking, reeking goo, spilled from split innards, that reds and yellows shivering in bubbles on his chin did not bother her. He was still as diligent as ever, but he did not bring more bodies into his den. Soon, the crush of men was no more, and only few moans arose as dulled echoes from darkness's throes. The boy with glasses worked tirelessly to elevate her master's woes, and she chose to feed him her blood herself, watching with a fascination as the egg yellow in his cheeks would become flower pink, and he would smile in answer and tell her that she was special, indeed. Come autumn, he was summoned back to Leaf's bosom. He told her that he had his secrets, too, smiling that smile of his that made him look like a serpent with borrowed human teeth, but he took her along this time. It was Chunin examinations season in Leaf, and her master, her keeper, her confider, placed a confidence in her to brave the forest of death, for what was this forest before his back garden? He smiled, she smiled, cheeks turning red as her hair. In morn's grace, his skin refused to catch light, lifeless and grey like the men whose lives he took with excessive liberty. She was elated that Leaf accepted her this time. Leaf's summer had rejected her once, yet, now, it, too, was struck raw by a viciousness that lingered long in autumn's wake. Winter, a receiver of autumn's mystic love, cold, a parting kiss, a gift of forever. The forest, true to its name, maimed children, yet men watched in glee the carnage the little ones had come to create for their delight. The brave ones would be hired in other villages, even Leaf. Was it that easy? Alas, life could never be so easy, no, never for the one that grew up in rain's mud. Some things rains could not make clean, pristine. Sought by children hungering to be rewarded by careless blue bloods, she hid away, but a beast plucked her out from a tree cave's sanctuary. She had hoped to reach the tower that appeared to dwarf the peaks that skewered the tender earth as easily as her master's knives and men's fleshes. Life was short, its mechanisms, whimsical. The beast dashed her hopes. Its snout was long, its tusks, thick. It would not leave here without stripping her of her flesh. Desperate to get away, she fell and lost her glasses, and world was cast in fogs. She saw a boy leap down from the tree and strike the creature down. Quickly, she wore her glasses and looked at the animal, a large boar, famished as men whose appetites could not be sated. Its belly was big and rotund, it had gone down on its side, its stomach sagging like ruined dough, jiggling like jelly, mouth foaming like men's pleasures, agape, teeth grime-coated and yellowed. There was little difference between men and beasts. After all, they all liked the taste of little girls. "Are you right?" The boy spoke at last, and she looked to him, and winter's subdued light that like moon's flight upon air touched his face, and she was bewitched. What was this boy if not Kami's magic trick? Kami had breathed life into his most cherished dream, and, from his befogged divinity, drunken and sick his mind, this boy had come forth to enliven her dreams, for she had never seen one, no man, nor woman as beautiful as he, and he was only a boy, far from the crapulent youth that would paralyse his body with unmatched pulchritude. Even Hanakoto was not this lovely. He spoke again, with a benny good nighty, his little mouth smiling, and she knew she was in deep love forever. She scrambled and grabbed hold of his hands in hers, and, overhead, sky cracked open and rain fell upon him, a purple lily. He was a lily, for chakra breaths came out to dance by his body. They knew, she knew, soil knew a secret no more. He walked, she followed, utterly besotted with his child flesh's drink, senses in abeyance. They walked under bowed limbs, lilies fragrant in the air. From a ruined child's corpse, scattered across mud and flower-like bits, he took a scroll and gave it to her as she had lost hers. She chose to stick with him and make it through to the end. She wanted to hold his hand again, but, thinking that he might not like her overbearing nature, she decided against it. Behind their backs, forest sang in anguish, it missed the breaths autumn's child had drawn unto himself. Little fairies, they came at him, kissed his flesh, went away, yellowed like fireflies. She did not understand, as she had never seen chakra breaths do this, glowing and shivering in grays, growing and shimmering red like the crest on his back. In his eyes he was an Uchiha. When they reached the tower, she summoned her courage to speak to him. "What's your name?" "I'm Uzumaki Karen," she said, an excitement in her voice that was unmistakable, and stood by his side and gazed into his night sky eyes that glimmered starless. "Uchiha Suzuki," he said, a smile lovelier than the lilies even, blooming on his lips, deeper than spring's love, redder than summer's heat. She loved him, she truly did. Night fell in the tower, and she sat close to him and looked upon him whilst he sat by a crooked window, his flesh brushed by moon in delicate ways, gentler and harsher than a mother's touch. Its love, a crazed dervish, moon never could part from his child. Upon reaching the forest's edge in the morning, she noticed that her master had been waiting for her, yet, like she, he was mesmerized by the boy. He sat down on one knee and fondled the boy's cheeks, his eyes stretching in a way as though the sleeping snake in him was wriggling awake. Autumn's nectar, not forgotten by winter, was beclouding his mind. "What a beautiful boy!" He spoke in a voice burdened by a desperation she had never seen in him before. "Are you lost?" She could tell that the boy did not enjoy her master's interest in him, though he kept quiet in the presence of the councilmen who stood about, smiling at the new champions. As though passion passed into mind's paradise, her master released the boy and stood up, tall and dignified again, but his eyes never left the boy's physiognomy. When winter reached its peak, harboring Higanbana on its breast like a murder most foul on snow, her master's agitation was unending. He refused to take his medicine in her blood, the blood-sucking plants withered away in cold, but he cared not. She felt that grief that arose from the distance between himself and the boy, whom he loved with the wild passion of an animal starved, was a sentiment he could not bear. He languished, lashed out at the medic boy, lamented his state of mind. Then one of the councilmen came through for a price, and the loveliest boy, Suzuki, was given over to his care. He was to train him, make him stronger, teach him forbearance children his age sorely lacked, but, before the boy came to his house, he cleared away the prisoners he called filth. The next day the stream ran red with blood, and fish came from the deep to feed on men that would be no more than memories in their bellies. How sad that men became so little in death. He tidied up the place, excited and frenzied, said that the boy was very special. When the boy came, he was beside himself, his joy stark on his sickly face. The boy was quiet, distrustful, her master, wary. He cursed the boy's brother under his breaths. The boy had a brother? She did not see him when he had come through the gates, she only saw white arms, whiter than old snow, attached to a shadow so deep that stood by trees. The boy was very lovely that she had thought he possessed moon's beauty and night's ink his parents from whom he came. Was this creature with arms white and vestments black his mother and father, in whom light and shadow mated to birth her little Kami king? She smiled, for that was as true as dreams to a child like her. Amen. The boy was spirited, brilliant beyond measure, that her master thought himself to be a person of lesser acuity. She did not understand, though she loved the easy manner in which the boy fashioned shapes from chakra, after he granted it a quickening nature very much like his own. Subduing earth's chakra was like second nature to him. When sun smiled, he trained the boy hard, sent him on errands, doted on him even when night coiled about sun, smothered it, and swallowed it up. He would ask of her to put a sleeping draught into his meal, to make him sleep fast and easy. She would always know where the draught was, stashed away behind ghoulish organs suspended in bubbly liquids. It was a phial stoppered with a chipped cork, colorless and tasteless. The boy never knew when he lost his senses after sleep. Her master would gather the boy to him and take him to where the corridor ended on an elaborate door. He is to be treated with care, he would say, settling down the boy gently on the table stashed full of strange items. Then he would slip his hand under the boy's hair, feel his face, put his face down into the layers lost, and she would tiptoe and stretch herself tall to look at the boy who had her little heart, her cheek squishy against the knuckles. He said that the boy had to be studied, but he was much too precious to be hurt. She agreed, poking at the boy's cheek where colors mixed faster than her master's concoctions with her finger, bending down and kissing his lips as much as she liked, brushing the plucked lily against his eyes all the while lights danced pretty in air. He was most careful in making a small incision in the boy's throat, and, like a bubbling heart, red came up to his delightful white, turned pink, flowed sideways. His blood told her master that he was the boy he had been waiting for all this time, that his was the flesh he was born coveting. She did not understand, though his frenzy frightened her. Days came running and nights went slithering, and the boy turned 12. In him, summer simmered beneath autumn's vengeful hand, and though his face was sweeter than honey, he developed a temper, too, but she did not care. Ever steadfast in her pursuit, fixing her mind upon him was easy. When her master was away, she would sneak into his room, sit with him on the bed that faced the sunken fireplace. Deep into the nights, she taught him of the bijou seals, of tales they had, of matters that governed flesh. In return for his kisses. In the glow of the yellows and oranges and reds, which would come like theater's shadows from fire, she played with the reluctant boy till the child's play sent him into a sticky froth. Then she would kiss him with tender carelessness and ask of him to taste her at the place where her thighs connected. He said that she tasted a little bitter, a little sour, nothing unpleasant, and just like that, she thought her love grew deeper with the way it allowed her to connect her flesh to the boy's flesh. She did not want to part from him, not ever. So when her master took him from her during nights, she resented him. Often, he would sit with the boy fast asleep in his arms and weep till pink fluids would come from his eyes like loose candy. He is not yet ripe. He lamented one night, coughing out blood that splattered into shiny ruby-like bubbles on the boy's cheek and lips. It sickened her master sickened her, and she sent a missive inside a leather-bound tube to the boy's brother, who was an Umbu commander now. When men from Leaf came, she gathered the boy, who slept deeply, into her arms and hid away in the basement. She could hear her master's and the medic boy's cries come down alongside blood that dripped through the gaps in the wooden floor above in syrupy trickles, but she sat humming, with the boy sleeping across her lap, kissing his lips, twisting her red and his black together in fine braids, for red and black looked pretty together like his eyes. When it went too quiet, she saw a white hand, attached to the equally white arm, reach down into the dark. The shadow was here, and it frightened her. Was it here to take her life, take the boy from her? She pressed the boy harder to herself and made a barrier with the funjutsu of her family to stave off the beast who had come to take the boy from her. She would not let him, he would have to kill her. And she was ready to die at the sight of the shadow that penetrated a lesser dark without sound, but then she saw the candle's light illuminate the shadow's blacks, fill them full with white. It was a man who looked much like the boy, but not quite. His beauty was coarse, his red, ugly, and harsh, adorned by lashes that fell on the pinwheel like shurikens as though they were veils. He said that he was the boy's brother and asked of her to remove the barrier, and after much hesitation, she did, and he lifted the boy into the cradle of his arms as though the little one belonged there, nowhere else, and his eyes grew tender at the sight of the boy, a longing in them satisfied. Then he turned and walked away, without looking upon her once. Chapter 78, Off the Edge. Temptation's tenderest missives to the heart beckoned him on, and he strode forth upon the rain-drinking soil of this region. He had not been there in so long. After his mentor met his end in a faint gloom, disturbed by Red's ferocity, this forest was a ghost, a memory forgotten in childhood's frivolities. Yet, now, it wept, tearing at roots that jutted from earth breaking. Fierce was its tormentor in the sky, purple spiteful, a volatile boy-child of warring shades. What surprises this land held! Storm was out, and it would dig out bones, shattered skulls, memories, time's shards in the eyes, red its thirst, fervid its vengeance. When children went out to get even, they did. Come out and play. Don't come again another day. And it was time to get even. Anger's engine fired, and flames stoked his spirit. Red night was red, sky was red, rain was red. What was passion if not murder in the night? A boy running red with blood, carrying the same unholy aroma of vengeance, beating out crackles of fury. Oh, his sibling, he was his heart's foe, its beats he was his heart, his beats. Children, so sweet, and you could not live with fires burning storms out, dreams singeing the eyes, if you could not endure, into the wound you struck deep, made it bleed. Rain shimmered silver on the stones in the mountain's face. One moment light plunged into waters, next it was black as his clan's passionless eyes. He jumped up, sticking to the stones, lightning quickening his pulses. It was easy to carve out his path, and about him, forest expelled sweet-smelling vapors. Spring had fled, yet, in storm's heart, autumn sang out spring's tune with godly finesse, a spill of colors, a craze of requital. A bleeding heart, what a poor, sad little boy. Pulsations that thrummed red about his gaze made him see the little cave in which he had played with his companion in the past, more childhood frivolities. It was akin to a broken mouth in a toy's face. He could see nothing. She had been meticulous. No light, nor chakra, escaped its invisible teeth. Her barrier had trapped everything within its infectious tendrils, and without storm crashed against valleys cowering in fright. He ran up against the wind that came down in white ropes that almost seemed to anchor this land to storm's eye. Retribution would come, and Leaf would swim ashore on its heart's bloods. Tit for tat, tit for tat. He smiled, a child in him gleeful, a foe baleful. Weasel, weasel, his brother was a weasel, and he would grant his eyes peace, piece by piece. Upon reaching the cave's mouth, all he saw was darkness in the back. Lies. He touched rain's strings that trickled from the slick Ken stones, and his fingers felt something airy that could not be felt, and his skin tingled. Karen, it's me. Let me in, he said, and he saw the barrier ripple to his voice. His voice ghosted across the shimmers, escaping the ripples upon the barrier's surface. This spectacle was like a child's magic trick. Karen and her quirks. Sometimes, he could not understand her. Light, a kindle, on the wall, defined her body's contours as though she had just materialized from nothing. Like always, she smiled, a smile that did little to hide away her licorice nature, softened quite a bit by her tendency to be playful as girl children. Across her cheeks, it spread a color whose tendency was to exhibit a shy demeanor, not the sort of headstrongness he associated with her. She made a seal and blocked his path and leaned up, like a hopeful, lovesick little girl. "Kiss me first," she said, lively and mischievous. Too weary to argue, he allowed her to give him a little peck on the cheek. Satisfied, she backed away, tittering like birds. His father's blood drained from his eyes when he stepped into the cave's refuge, and Chakra spoke less to him. In the back where it was a bit dark, a man sat slumped and exhausted by a lantern whose paper was torn and old. He looked half asleep, but Suzuki's footfalls jolted him to a state of wakefulness. He jumped to his feet, body less crooked than its shadow, and blinked and stared, repeatedly. Suzuki stepped into the solid shaft of light and a shiver of realization morphed the man's features into a state of shock. He nearly fell forward and grabbed hold of Suzuki's hand. "You." He slurred and wiped sweat from his face, for terror in his blood kept his body warm. "Kisuk?" Suzuki asked, a little surprised at the man's unusual reaction upon seeing him in the flesh. Kisuk nodded and grinned as though he was gay as a candy-suckling child. "Do you remember me?" "You," Kisuk began again, with much fervor this time, "you've grown. But your face it's almost the same. You was off 15. 16. Time flies." And he was panting, holding onto Suzuki's hand in a tough grip. "I don't," he stopped, anger reuniting inside his eyes, another memory stolen by his brother. Thief. But why? He had to know what the weasel had hidden from him. "I don't remember," he said, plainly. "Have we met?" Kisuk let out a startled laughter, his eyes stretching and catching more light, making his browns lighter. "Don't look good as I used to. Life got me bad," he said, almost chomping on words with furious precision. "Told you about the elite forces' involvement in you's families killing nasty men. You didn't believe me. By Kami, you was mad but you let me go. I'm grateful." His wicked sibling had concealed another truth? How many? Sapped of vigor, Suzuki sat down on the large stone and faced the jagged rocks, and Karen sat down by his side, her hand in his hair, her head on his shoulder, her arm round his arm. How much had Itaka lied over the years? Weasel. Damon. Liar. He spoke not a word of the fury that played silly with his soul till it was fatigued and pushed from his eyes, leaving glints of its intensity round the blacks. Kisuk sat down opposite of Suzuki and shuffled around nervously whilst he searched for words to speak to him of the matter. The young Uchiha looked angry. I gave the Uchiha scroll to the girlie here. I'd stolen it from your medic," he said, stitching words together as they escaped his mouth faster than thoughts. "Forgive me." Suzuki said nothing, too engrossed in listening to Vengeance's great machine that throbbed about him louder than thunderous skies. Now, he looked at Kisuk as he smelled himself and looked embarrassed that he stank like piglets let out in rains. His slipshod heels, old clothes, mangled hair that stuck out from his head in all directions made him feel more embarrassed than before. "How much did you tell Suijitsu?" Suzuki asked, at last, and leaned his back against the rough wall. Kisuk let out a little cough like chortle, eyes shining like coins. "Slippery fella, don't trust him. Do you?" he said. "No," Suzuki said, and his mouth worked the miracle of the loveliest smile that made him look like a sweet child in the face. "But why don't you trust him?" "'Cause Kisame don't," he said, sighed, "and that's good enough for me." "Why?" Suzuki asked, persistent, his smile not leaving his lips. "Don't know," he said, gnashed his teeth together twice in a manner as though he was making them adjust to the mechanisms of a new mouth. "You can ask I'm yourself if you find I'm. Where is he? Sooner or later, Mist will sniff him out. They haven't forgotten." "How long does he plan on playing hide and seek?" he asked, narrowed his eyes red to the tightest flowers. "He's vanished into the sea, damned fish," he said breathlessly, as though his voice could not keep up with his word. "Haven't heard from him in weeks. Could be rotten dead in waves for all I know. A dead end." Suzuki straightened his neck and sighed deeply and looked up at the wall, upon which great globs of shadows danced away from light. By his side, Karen hummed, her eyes closed against the gray that filled the cave, her hand on his. Was in the squad. Kisuke started speaking at last, a sense of pride in his words, wearied of the young Uchiha's quietness amidst Storm's madness, was there when the ceremony happened. Sasuke bent his Sharingan upon his features, his flowers spinning and stopping inside the whites, but he said nothing. Okamai clan he stopped and filled his lungs with wet air and exhaled a long breath, they was the secret keepers. They made them tunnels in leaf, too. Your root rats probably still use the tunnels in the ground. When? He asked and curiosity shined his eyes to a sharper red. Don't know, but they was there before leaf. All I know's that Okamai was asked to make he said, didn't think it'd do you any good to know about this, but her brother's convinced that you's brothers killed her. Has he? And he was grinning, craning his neck like curious birds, allowing the light to settle upon the yellow that existed on his teeth in a solid layer. He has, Sasuke said, and Kisuke scratched his chin, perplexed. You sure? The Cloud Dog had lots to say about a foul plan he'd made in his head to end Shichi. Her death's made a mess, bandit clans is poppin' up everywhere, and they means business, bad business, Kisuke said and leaned forward, eyes focusing on the petals Sasuke's Sharingan had made extra excited. I'm sure, he said and looked across the cave's features upon which unmixed yellows and blacks existed, boldly shivering. He went there to get something. He has it. Who for? He asked. Tsunade, he said. What was it? He asked. I don't know, he said, sighing. Itachi is not very chatty. Karen, a little surprised at Sasuke's decision to deliberately refer to his brother directly, did not speak. He was angry, and, this time, she did not think his anger would choose the lull of slumber, not without a nice meal. Never you mind, Sasuke said and smiled, and his smile was colder than before upon the physiognomy that was more innocent than that of a child's. What's this secret keeper business? I hope you didn't tell Suijutsu. He has a light stomach. I like my neck, Kisuke replied and touched his neck and gulped. Didn't tell him that I'd talked to the Uzumaki whore who made the seal. They was putting on the base seal like masks on me Numbu men. He bent forward and moved his hand over the other. Kushina? Sasuke asked, delighted that he had not been wrong. Leaf played with a priced seal, a seal designed to obscure Uchiha vision. Kisuke nodded, gray flowing back and forth across his countenance. It was a cold night and it gets cold as death in autumn. Winter's worse. Out there in that land? Feels like you was dying a bad death, he said in a manner as though he was telling a children's story and shivered for he could almost feel the sensation from that night. Full moon like a pearl. Can't forget that night. They placed a seal on a girl wee thing hardly 3. Couldn't even wipe her nose right. Kikyo yes, that was her name but me? I was honest, always been an honest man. My mum used to tell me so I told that something about this wasn't right, you know? Branding a lil lassie like that, but they says the chakra and the seal's at its peak on such nights. Didn't make a lick o' sense to me. He pulled his mouth down in a disapproving scowl and shook his hand and backed away. Sasuke listened, his mind in another realm. The seal Karen created with his chakra had reacted to the chakra that seeped from the Biju base seal that existed on Naruto. Why could he see it back then, yet not now? Why? From outside, wind brought in voices from Storm's heart, and in his veins, his vengeance thrummed in loveliest reds. Something bad happened in Leaf, Kisuke said, and his voice disturbed Sasuke's undisciplined thoughts more. Yu's host went mad, killed people. Yu's family was blamed for it. Sasuke looked to Kisuke, his flowers on fire, fury their succulent meal, but he stayed silent, eyes speaking where he could not, heart beckoning where he could not, veins singing where he could not. A flesh, an amalgam of desire, is that not all what he was born to do? His burden, his love? Oh, Kami, grant him mercy, love, life. His mother would pray for the older one, a mist-touched fairy, queen of his heart. Amen. Itachi, yet what was his mercy if not empty? What was his love if not bereft of mercy? What was his life if not nurtured by the unliving? Amen, Oka-san, amen. Danzo asked Yagura to cut loose from the squad. Minato and Hayashi. Don't know, Kisame wouldn't tell me. Maybe he don't know, he said with a softer accent and a sense of finality, looked at Sasuke as though expecting him to say something on the matter. Suzuki did not say anything and rose to his feet. Karen did, too, eyes on his features, questions on her tongue, beats on her heart. Then he made his way to the cave's mouth. Karen did, too, white flashed and splashed like martyr's blood upon the valley. Send Yugo a missive. He can't stay in rain. He won't make it, Suzuki said, his tone, though subdued, unusually harsh. What do you want me to say to him? He isn't close by, you know. He could be anywhere, Karen said, protest evident in her voice that Suzuki chose to ignore. I told him to stay close to waterfalls. He'd be there. Tell him to get Kisuke into the other village, he said, his sherry nons redder than his flames. Use the seal on him. I don't want him blabbering in death. But Suzuki, she stopped at the sudden, shocking flare of his chakra, a voiceless whiplash. In reflex, his head snapped in her direction, and he hissed, do as you're told. His eyes, big and threatening, burned cruelly in his face, afflicted greatly by anguish, and she could clearly see the rigid definition of his neck muscles, green veins, pinking skin beneath the rain droplets. Youth was kindest to his splendor that had corrupted the boy in him in delightful ways. His beauty, ripened by time, had overwhelmed the boy-child's loveliness, inflicted devastation upon her heart, felled her spirit to be in love and lust with him, yet so had his fury that had grown in equal strength and measure by feeding upon grief's delights. Itaki had ruined him in more ways than one, and she would never forgive him for what he had done. Was Suzuki the greatest magic trick Kami had played on her? Her flesh could scarcely bear her lust and love. Bothered by his fresh anger, she said nothing, chose looking, words skewered to her tongue like animals bleeding upside down. He spoke of nothing, turned his face away, peering down into the valley that had drowned deeply into night, in the manner of a curious child. Standing on the edge, his existence distilling into the sensations of fury, he located the thrill of salvation in storm's lightning that crashed into the mountain's height and shook its core. Oda-sama, would you see your sons now? Did your eyes blossom when they bore death's burden? Why do you weep? He closed his eyes, his body shivering, one step off the edge, just one step, and there would be no way back. This was love, vengeance in wind's knife. Oto-sama, would you love me the way I love you? Did you think of me when you left here? For I see nothing of me in your memories. Why do I weep for you? Why do I love you? Is it that I wear your sight? A mist-clothed fairy, king of seduction, his sibling, and all his knife, his vengeance, required was a white neck, upon which red would bloom sweeter than spring's naive pink. Lightning hit at the mountain again, shaking free the black in the vale below, light glimpsing, bursting, fingerlings swimming in foam. The storm's bad. Suzuki, where are you going? Suzuki? She asked, wet red hair hitting her face harder than lake pebbles, distressed. The capital, he said, and stepped off the edge and went down into the valley's mouth, torn open by storm's cleansing punishment. Unusually quiet, his anger existed upon his features, most pronounced upon his brow. The rest of his countenance, whiter than moon swept up in storm's angers, was calm. This was a condition which only he could exhibit, yet he could not say he had ever seen the young lord this furious. He stayed silent. He had been his lord since he was a child. It was not his place to say anything to him. What does it say? He asked, his voice deeper than storm's whisperings that came from the outside. He unrolled the scroll, careful as to not displease him more than he was. It states that Hinata's position needs to be given to another gen until she isn't reinstated, he said, and quietly rolled up the scroll. From where he stood, his lord's face was white and black in equal portions. He sat in the large chair by the window, glass cup in hand, in which deep red liquid moved. She isn't being clever with her schemes, he added, wanting to dispel a bit of his lord's fury. For a few moments, the lord said nothing. Then he partook of the drink and took in a deep breath. You have an awkward sense of humor, Serizawa, he spoke, and his voice was less deep than before. Itaki-sama, he stopped, but he could not keep it to himself anymore. Suzuki's he's gone. A lot of men were whispering about what he said to you. I don't think they heard everything, but the guard said that he didn't stay there long. He went home and left a letter F for you, but he's gone. I wanted you to know. Of course he is, he spoke slowly, words drenched in ire that could not weather his nature, and his was a cold one that had not known love's softer face. Then it was quiet as sleeping stones in shrines, little boy children frozen upon stones' faces. Flashes came, and he saw red in Itaka's face, glaring and harsh his eyes. It is ruined, he spoke, his hand trembling once in an eye-fleeing moment, all is ruined. Itaka-sama, he gasped, unsure of what to say, which words to choose, for all this was beyond him, he'd come back home. You shouldn't worry. He said it in his missive. Sweet child, he listened to me, he spoke, and coil by coil, his heart mirrored itself in his gaze, a heart beating in his eyes. He kept quiet when I told him to leave things be. He sat down and drove his anger out when I told him not to dwell on the past. Now? He has challenged me. The child challenges me. He has never challenged me. The emissaries and the councilmen would come soon. He has driven me against the wall. There was loose red, like a string, that came from his right nostril that Sarizawa saw, unease pitting his stomach. When had he taken that accursed poison? Leave, Itaka spoke, his voice airy and whispery, and he was left with no choice but to leave his lord leave him be in his own playground. Itaka barely heard the click, yet he saw it disturb the air in volatile vibrations. Then he leaned his head back, eyes upon the web that floated against the air, shurikens cutting the air's fabric in two, cutting. Whilst his flesh, sight, soul trembled, there was the sting of breaths, each an exquisite drink for spirit, and what a beautiful drink it was, hitting upon the heart as upon the earth, solid as stone in long winter. Suzuki his child, his son, his darling, a foe against his beats tenderest flow. His grip tightened on the glass cup, and into his palm it shattered, shivering red everywhere, ache gliding along the arm with feline grace, his fingers long, pretty like the horse spider's legs, stripped red decorated brides. It was the color purposed to pull the very soul of him from himself. How to stop the child, but the child would not listen. How to end his foes, but the fate would not listen. How to stop the child and end his foes. Ah, yes. He laughed, mad, eyes upon the spread of autumn's sky that had appeared into his winter's night, his domain, for Kami had birthed no night deeper than his blood, such was his love, his passion's flood. This was true, was it not? He reasoned, his love was pure, his heart, fire. There was no equal for his mystic desire. Little child, poor child, said child. He did not know how much he loved him. Why did he weep for the dead? They did not love him the way he did. Oh, Kami was envious of his love, he thought, poison rendering his mind in honest hues. Why did the dead pull the child from his arms? He would not let them. In this realm, he took his measure of his Okasan and Oto-sama and saw autumn spreading, battling against winter, yet, like rivers could not return from sea, the child was meant to know defeat. Winter was supreme, singular, autumn, a sublime child still gripped with colors and naivete. It would take time to ripen in her womb after it grew from his seed in his dreams. Then he wrestled his creators into the ground, man's flesh spreading at the throat like a thread broken, woman's flesh spreading at the thighs like fish wide open, and dimmed and smothered them with ardor. Grunting and gyrating on the splayed flesh, a flower he wantoned through. Pleasure squeezed the eel, and it shot forth the froth from which life germinated in winter. The belly grew, rounded, bore his love. Then his whole life spilt out from her bifurcated womb. There he was, his child, his little darling, blinking, weeping, for he had just taken his first breath. And color was making merry in her eyes, and then it was gone and blood leapt out in delightful gushes. What was this if not love? And he whispered to the babe's bloodied face, I will set the world to ruin to love you, I will set you to ruin to love you. And from above, his greater eye opened wide and wept at the spectacle. He thought himself to be a martyr. Ah, worry and woe, he was created to shoulder it all. Then the little child was clean in his arms, cooing and restless. He smiled, awed by the little thing clothed in Kami's beauty. Then his world fluttered away like loose black feathers, and he felt bile fill his mouth. Outside, rain came down in long grey strokes, yet he needed his fury gone, so he went out into the rain-wrecked night, dream fleeing from his eyes, and heaved by a tree, storm beating into his back with savagery. The sensation went away, and he palmed water into his mouth. Looking down, he noticed pink flying in merging droplets from his hand and arm, but he paid it no mind. The walk back home was with a purpose this night, but his home was quiet. Without the child's presence, he felt its silence more. This storm would not end so easily. White blasted across the sky and spread over his room's wall. He could see black boughs painted into its color by shadow hands. He had changed his clothes for fresh ones, another uniform. Fire blazed in the sunken fireplace, but his eyes looked upon the painting in the alcove. His father had painted it. When? He could not say, though the colors were still vibrant. He saw Higanbana looking weepy red in snow right under the shadow that cut deep across the scroll in the middle. It was the season of its death. His father was a sentimental man. At that moment, the door opened, and Rao walked in. In the fire, her hair tended more to yellow than silver. There were words in her eyes, but he did not want to speak to her. Silently, she walked in and silently she sat down by the fire, red going into the furrows nature had dug into her visage. The night is harsh. You should rest, he spoke and lifted the sword from the wooden sword stand. You are leaving? She asked, her voice softened by emotion. Yes, he answered, strapped the sword to his back, turned to look upon her. My darling, it is a terrible storm, she spoke, almost hesitant. You should not punish yourself. Let your anger rest. Stay. Why must you leave now? He will come home. I cannot wait for him to return. I must go to him, for your generosity to a stranger has ruined me. He cut across her, his mouth smiling unnaturally. Itake. Rao gasped, shocked, sprung to her feet. Child, I love you. You are my heart. Why do you? It has, he spoke, his eyes smiling unnaturally. You brought that girl into my house. I protested, yet you did not listen. I told you that she used to raise her hand to the child, yet you chose her. I warned you of her nature, yet you did as you pleased. Now, I would have to bow before my child. Shame myself. If I do not do this, he would not listen. She has laid everything bare. My life. She has poisoned it. You created this mess. How can you be calm when I cannot rest? Itake, child, she stopped, coughed, for grief burned her eyes raw, she drank poison. She has not opened her eyes since. She may die. I feel terrible. I did not want this, not for you, never for you. Fate was kinder to her than I would have been, he spoke and left the room without looking upon her. Outside, Storm's ferociousness had lost its vigor. It almost seemed as if it had located a new purpose, a new foe. He wanted to take the trail out of the forest, but the temple called to him. Water that had gathered on the stone pathway trembled away from his feet. It was quiet, but his mother's charms could not be heard by him. Rain, thin and silver, fell down softly and tinkled on the stone statues. The guardian deities, two little boys, smiled in rocks. Did the rain make them happy? The moon was kinder to their features that had worn away through leaf seasons. He did not stop his walk, moving in their midst whilst they smiled to be reborn after death together for all times, hand in hand. Inside, Temple's lull greeted him. It did not seem as though this place had witnessed Storm's ire. He climbed down the stairs without lighting fires, his sherry non was sufficient. The muniment room held records of his clan's history that had never interested him. He lighted the lantern by the heavy set of drawers, and, instantly, a yellow rippled onwards across the darkness. The back of the room was black, but the light was enough for him to read the missive his father had written with special ink. He took out the missive with the shrine marked tunnel business. Perhaps it was time to know more? So he unrolled the scroll and read the words of a dead man. Takagi. In this time of winter, I pray for your health. The tunnels haunt our people. Leaf's councilmen say little, yet I know of the treachery that runs deeper than mountains in this land. I had thought wrong, the tunnels were made after the betrayal of Madara-sama at his people's hands. How could the Elders' Council not see the flow of fates? It burdens my spirit. This land was bought from Fire Country's daimyo at a steep price. Perhaps it is the price we paid with our trust. A secret was kept from us. Why? I cannot say. It seems to me that honor does not burn in the Senjo's blood, for Senjo Tobirama commissioned a bandit clan to carve a Venus network of tunnels into the soil. Why were our people not told of this? Was Leaf meant to be our grave? I will not let this happen. The bandits, Okamai clan, knew these lands. They granted the tunnel's purpose by connecting them to the caves in which Earth's chakra slept. We Uchiha had left this land many moons ago, yet the chakra did not leave. No, it stayed and slumbered in wait. Now, it has woken in excitement. It is a marvelous thing truly. It reacts to my little one. His birth has roused it. I do not know what to make of it, for it was nurtured by Madara's unnatural spirit before it was never visible the way it is now. The boy. He is beautiful, little, remarkable, only few months old, yet I see much in his eyes. I hope you can come and gaze upon him and the miracle his birth has brought to us. The Uchiha land matters in the capital can wait. I pray for your safe return. Fugaku. Tobirama, not Danzo, commissioned the tunnels? He was not surprised by Tsunade's lie, yet his father had said nothing of the tunnels matter he himself did not know. Itaka breathed out a flame, and, when it touched his father's words, they burnt away in ashes, but he smiled a deep and lovely smile, for the son Fugaku spoke of was Suzuki. Then he left the temple like a ghost, as if he had never visited upon it at all. There was storm in the sky whilst she ran, skies spread about angry clouds that let out purple and violent beats. Rain beat at her from the front, pushed her back, but she dug her feet solidly into the soft soil, mud flying at the heels. When would this storm end? She could hear the Yamanaka man behind her back, though he was slower than she. It was an arduous task to sense whilst braving autumn storms. After all, chakra had a tendency to vanish like ghosts. Not choosing to dwell on it, she focused her attention on the man in front. He was slower than usual. Why? She could not say. It was not as if she could ever understand his heart. He probably knew he was being followed, but it was Umbu custom to check upon soldiers that fled villages without orders. A scowl altered the nature of her features. Itaka would protect him, as always, her greens sharpened by the anger, lighter than the foliage night had obscured. Yet it was impossible to let him not affect her heart. The closer she drew, the more her fear intensified at his chakra's raging torrents. The whiter and brighter sky seemed to become. What if he killed her? Her heart stalled, but gained its rhythm quickly. He was no fool, for killing inside Leaf's barrier was suicide. She had come with a kunao, dipped in the pink moth's poor poison, to fight back if he chose to retaliate. The Yamanaka man was not swift on his feet, nor in mind, to catch the lightning-quick Uchiha, though it was worth the effort. Suddenly, he ran so fast, tearing through storm which seemed to be his extension, that he fled beyond her senses' reach by a mile. Where was he? She looked behind once and increased her speed and jumped off the rocks into the limpid mass that was this night's shadow. It parted, her eyes fighting against the black that had turned to dull gray, so they beat on, their footfalls sending pebbles ricocheting into other pebbles. On their left, white shone on and off the water's surface that was not calm. A great gust scourged the waters and waves flew and crashed onto her. Water, black and quick, trembled away from beneath the foam. From above, whites rushed down and spread out as specters out to hunt, and in her head, everything roared. She could hear not a thing. She did not stop and thrust more chakra into her legs, and, in reaction, she felt her muscles strain and tighten to their limits. It hurt. Then she jumped over a large rock and landed into the forest that whipped about against storm. Deeper she needed to go deeper. Where had he run off to? They were far away from Leaf now, and her heartbeats, fearful of his wrath, fell and rose in harmony. Suddenly, he stopped, but, before her mind could think of a way to respond to his decision, he vanished. What? She gasped, running, panting. All about her, storm seeped deeper into the forest, its voice a muted tone amidst the clustering trees, purring. Slowing down, she looked about, her senses hitting no man save the Yamanaka in back of her. At last, she arrived at the spot, a broken shrine under the quietest tree, forgotten in the forest. It could have been a grave of a sibling, child, parent? It was impossible to tell, but here his chakra had escaped her sensing. She looked up and peered at the storm that had moved away from Leaf's heaven to raise hell elsewhere. He was gone. The Yamanaka man, Tashiro, came running and she looked at him. He held a lighted chakra stick in his hand, a basic supply item all shinobi carried that turned rudimentary chakra into flame at the tip. A smothered red threaded his gold hair and spread and shone upon the misty air that was brighter than the blood she saw on operating tables sometimes, on her palms. She could not tell which expression he wore upon his visage, his eyes, a mystery in the monkey root mask, in which she thought he looked silly. "He's gone," she said and wiped a careless hand across her cheeks. "There isn't any teleportation mark here," he said, an accusation subtle in his tone that she did not miss, and removed the mask to reveal his youthful face and green eyes that had taken much of the red into them. "How did he get away?" "He was there right there," she said, angered, and pointed at the shrine. "He's gone now. What do you want me to do? Did you think this was going to work?" She laughed a short, derisive laugh that echoed more in the midst of trees than she had thought possible. Toshiro exhaled a sharp breath that disturbed the flame and granted more green back to his eyes. "This wasn't about detaining him. You know this, Sakura. He wasn't going to let you sense him, you fool," Sakura said and turned her head away from the light, eyes like paradots in her face. "How did he get away?" he asked himself, ignoring her anger. "I don't know," she answered, calmed, and looked down at the rain-kissed shrine. The forest, now quiet, made it appear more like a lonely grave than before. "He must have a seal on him, probably from the Uzumaki woman that hangs on his arm," he said and looked at her countenance and silver-striped spring hair. Sakura said nothing, her gaze lost in the little boy's smile in the stone. It was broken, like the head of the older sibling, the hands where their fingers connected in stone had fallen away. Now, a shadow moved along the shrine's fragmented bricks and rocks that were no more than memories. Who had built them? "How's the Hyuga girl?" he asked and broke her from her thoughts. "I don't know why I need to watch her," she answered and pulled her gaze from the shrine and looked at him. "She isn't even in the squad anymore. It's a waste of time. Danzo-sama has. Danzo-sama should tell me what he wants me to do." She cut across him, biting back the temptation to box his ear, her fury coming back. "I'm tired of all this. Naruto isn't getting any better. This wasn't what he promised me. Look, don't show me this temper." "I'm only doing my job," he replied, sighing. "You want answers? Go and talk to him yourself." Then he looked upon her once more, his eyes fleeting green against red, and left her in the forest. By the time she made it back to Leaf, it was sleeping deeply. Storm had left hours ago, its fury taken whence it had come. Lights blinked on doors, and she heard faint sounds from inside shops. Merchants brought in the stock early. Many shinobi preferred things fresh. She resented this arrogance of wanting, not giving. Shinobi practiced more solemnly than creed. Her father was a victim of their faith. For a moment, she stopped, stood on the pathway, upon which yellowed rainwater shivered. She wanted to go home, to her parents, but the thought of seeing her father wrung out the sentiment from her heart. Suzuki, her freedom and her prison. Night breeze moved crackling leaves across the stones, and, amidst their rising tones, she chose to go back to her home wearied. When she opened the door, she saw the man she was not expecting to see, Naruto. He grinned at the sight of her, forever a boy. His cheeks, swarthy and round, tightened with sentiments she knew to be true. He always was in love, a fool. "Naruto," Sakura gasped, surprised. "When did you come?" "Some hours ago," he replied, enthusiasm visible in every part of his features. "Are you hungry?" she asked and sat down by his side, and he, as always, pressed himself into her, longing for an embrace from her. "No, he broke off, his breath warm against her wet ear. "I left Hinata. I set her free, I'm free." And at this, Naruto threw his arms about Sakura, clasped her to himself, and she forgot to breathe. She could not say a thing, hands trembling on his back. "Mother and father have changed their minds," he said between deep breaths, and she knew he was weeping again, for she felt a warm wetness engulf her cheek. "They said that it's all right, that you and I are all right." He backed away, his hands closed around hers, tears sparkling in purple light upon his blue. Silence, sweetest rain splintering the memory forest in her thoughts, in whose wilds she perished at Lily's roots, and he saw a grimace of pain go from her smiling countenance. Surprised, his face lost its joyous visage and revealed his anxiousness. "You Sakura-chan, you're not," he stopped, weeping fresh tears, "you're not happy." "What?" No, Naruto. "Course I am." She almost shouted and clasped him to her bosom again. I'm happy if you're happy. And this time, upon smelling autumn's scent in his hair, Suzuki's distance crushed her, and she grieved. And she was lonely and she was sick with lust and love and she was angry, so she made love to him the way she liked, brought him to herself from the back, rubbed her sweat-covered body against his, head spinning and body shuddering in feverish anticipation, for she was more lost in lust than he. Storm had fled, and she felt more alone than ever. The temple was quieter than her family's graveyard. In winter, which was coming, the well in their house went dry, so servants went to the graveyard to draw water from the retarded stream whose waters thinned, and fish fled to warmer waters in the Uchiha village whence it was said to originate, from deep inside a boy-child deity's shrine. Inside the Jizo hall, she gathered the sutra scrolls scattered about the wooden floor and sat down by the altar upon which a quiet golden Buddha stood. Paintings of 10 worlds, stages of human cycle, it was all here. In her youth, her mother had been a Shira Bhikkhuni, a follower of the Jizo cult. She dispensed knowledge of the unborn child's appeasement and preached for fundraising. A white tsubaki in hand, she went from temple to temple and instructed women to pray to be spared and protected from the fate in the Chi no Ike. They all wanted Kami to protect them from death in childbirth and the damnation that was to follow. Oka-san, are you suffering? I pray for you, she whispered and looked up at the statue, its eyes as hard and golden as his body, her eyes sparkling gold in grief. Her mother was young and pretty when she perished, dimpling cheeks, pink lips, long hair. That was all she could remember of her. Her brother was born dead, and, in vengeance, he had taken her mother, too. Why? She used to ask, but her mother was without words beyond the shore, so was Buddha by her side. She decided when Hinata was a girl that once she had bloomed to the age when it was expected that she become wed, she would be given over to her betrothed, Naruto. How happy had she been, a child excited for weddings and play. Alas, it was never meant to be. And she had resented and loved her equally for so long, perhaps it was time to let go. Ona-san, a girl's voice said from the back, and she looked to the door. It was Hanabi, and she was smiling. Hinata lowered her gaze a bit and noticed that her belly had rounded a bit. She turned to the Buddha, pressed her palms together, bent her head, and prayed for the safe birth of the unborn and her sister that was dear to her. Should we go home? It's cold. Hanabi said, shivering, standing by the light that moved across her face lightly than spring's rains. Hinata got to her feet and gathered the scrolls and put them in the bag she had brought with her. When she stepped outside, Leaf glimmered about a mile yonder, a lively spot of green amidst a lush landscape, battered by autumn. She wore her sandals and Hanabi curled her fingers about hers and together they walked down the stone pathway. Suddenly, Hinata stopped by the shrine and looked back. Rain droplets sprung off from the statues and floating eaves and hit the stone pathway and light fainted in the hall. The servants would have to blow out the flames come morning, but, in that light, Buddha's golden eyes asked of her to make a wish, and she did, for she wanted to see him so badly. Smiling, she started walking again alongside her sister, and they left to leave under a clearing sky. Chapter 79, My Conditions, Your Conditions. Shadow villages, they all rioted in a way good men would not. But what was a man that was good? He had asked himself often. His Oto-sama had little words to spare for his questions. He would look upon him, surprised, but say nothing save words a father would spare for a little boy of 4. His Nii-san would speak of Leaf, a shine in his eyes, a dangerous hue in his mouth. The prostration of man before its tree, the ultimate love. Then he, too, would look upon him and say that he loved him more than he loved Leaf. A boy of 3, he believed him. His Oka-san was different, for she had much to say. She wrote poetry, made sparrow origamis for Itake, sang songs. In winter afternoons, she would take him into the forest, his hand in hers, and there she would talk. She liked talking, a fairy draped in endless white, for she loved to adorn herself with white, dappled with a bit of reds, purples, blacks here and there to grant her garments a sense of completeness. When snow fell, he could not tell her body apart from snow. There she would sit on the edge of snow, black hair floating. Sometimes, he thought that she looked much like a lost ghost, but not an ugly ghost, no. No, Mikoto was beautiful. She was red Sasanqua bleeding in winter's woe, red butterfly living in spring's spirit, morning dew sparkling in summer's sun. She was What was she in autumn? His thoughts stopped and spun again, whirling faster than petals in his eyes. There was a scent of sandalwood in her hair always, every other day, and he could smell it now as though it were yesterday. He walked alongside her taller frame, looking up at her countenance that was illuminated by autumn's light. She held his little hand in hers, her walk slow for she wanted them both to walk side by side. This made him happy, very happy. Little mouse, don't run up the hill, drop the onigiri for you had had your fill. Mikoto sang, in high spirits, for she liked to sing the little poems she wrote, often. Oka-san? He asked, watched leaves exist upon her cheeks in grey imitations, smiled. Oka-san, where are we going? To the shrine, she said and bent her head to look at him. I want berries from there. Berries? He asked, a little breathless, moving his legs faster. Yes, berries, she said and returned her eyes to the narrow trail ahead that was invisible under many leaves that had fallen from autumn's sickness. They're good against poisons. You can eat them, too. There was a liveliness in her voice that was at odds with autumn's stranger nature, though autumn loved the sound that came from her throat as the air danced, invigorated by her song. Time flies, does it fly like cranes? Like crow's plumes? Like scents in spring's blooms? Like dusts in summer? Leaves in autumn? Mists in winter? It flies by, in a blink, but you never see it fly away, yet it did go astray. A ghost, a mirage in the hot spot in desert running. Time flies, when did it fly? A groove in the face? A loss in youth's haze? A waning in lover's gaze? Gone it flies, time flies. They crunched through the forest, sun hiding behind their backs, shining. Sun struck the reds and tangerines and yellows in front, going into the droplets floating upon their dry husks. They seemed to come alive with suns upon them, like stars upon the dried-up Suna deserts, and they winked and blinked and glimpsed. They mounted the stairs, slow and steady, one stair at a time. When they reached the top, Mikoto stopped and prayed to the statue that was always quiet underneath the shade. He could not tell if he had ever seen it move. He looked at her, her white cheek hidden by loose hair, and imitated her posture, not knowing what to say. Should he pray? Pray for what? He had everything. Then, just like that, she finished her prayer and looked at him, and he pretended to do the same. Should we look for berries? She said, and he bounced and ran all over the place to find shrubs that bore them like little gifts. They were not hard to find, most grew from deep cracks in stones, cradled boy deities' shrines, stood at Buddha's feet flourishing in autumn's unending damp. It took a while to fill up the bag she had on her arm, but they had gathered enough to last them the whole season. We won't need any more, she assured him, and sat down on the stone stair by the boy deity's shrine. Then from her bag's pocket, and she had sewn many pockets in there, she took out a red paper and began to make an origami. In the sunlight as it receded before him, her beauty was an effect of Kori's of Kami's beauty, and, in that moment, he resented the red pinwheel in her hand, that which took from him her heart and set it upon a course that made him miss her even when she was around. Stones in many humanoid shapes stood about them, their eyes looking, yet not seeing. How could they? They were born blind, and, as anger bothered him, he picked up a pebble and struck the large statue that stood by her, looking upon her in eternal silence. The pebble ricocheted and disappeared behind the flora and left a sound that shook calm from silence. The sharp sound startled her, and the three-pointed pinwheel that spun in air dropped from her hand. This satisfied him, though he did not smile, but when she looked to him, he looked away to the stream where the stone had fallen. There, he saw bubbles and koi mouths that showed above water. Suzuki! Come here, come! She said between soft gasps, and, though he did not want to let her win so easily, he went to her regardless. Mikoto took his hands in hers and said, defiling the shrines is heretical. Don't do that. Oh, Suzuki, why would you do that? Kami would be angry with you. I don't want them to be angry with you. Then she drew him to herself, weeping, praying, gasping. Kami, forgive him. She wept, sighing. He's a little boy. He won't do it again, he won't. And she was looking up, sunlighting upon dazzled eyes, kissing his eyes, mouth, cheeks. Suzuki concentrated on the statue behind them. It was an ominous visage, shrouded by a shadow from a greeting night that would be deep. It took some moments for the state to pass, and when it did, her smile was good as new as though she had freshly painted it upon her lips. "Why are you angry?" she asked in a childlike voice, for he knew she was being purposely playful, pinched his round plump cheek, watched a pleasant pink grace the skin she had touched, eyes rounded like big round stones that filled deep hollows in a doll's face, mouth, of delicate red, smiled, barely curtained perfect teeth. She really was like a big pretty doll dressed in white. Suzuki looked down to his feet, a shyness in his face. "Oka-san, why you don't love me?" he asked, and a child's grief appeared as sincere signs in his eyes. "Oh, but I do," she said, spirited, and smiled a big smile that made red sasankor rise in her robust cheeks. "Why don't I make anything for me?" he asked, saddened, and looked to her with eyes that trapped autumn's sun in his grief. "You make mfoni-san, not me. I won't speak to you." "Ah," she gasped, lifting him up, pressing him into herself. "Do you want to make me sad?" "I'd cry if I'm sad." "No, don't cry," Suzuki sniffled, words muffled by her dress. He sat like this for some time, heaving long breaths in the manner of adults. Then he sat up straight and he was smiling again. A child's anger was forgotten easily, for it lacked memory's temper, though he was too young and at pains to explain why. He looked about and noticed the manifested symptoms of dusk upon the horizon, a pink transforming to a better red. The slow burble of stream was more audible, now that the day was truly drowsy. Soon, it would be night, though, as a child, he was full of energy and not weary of playing, so he hopped off her lap and ran to the stream to catch a koi for his Oka-san. The koi were fast in the slow waters. Bubbles, shiny like the coins he kept, popped at the surface and they scattered as soon as he slipped his hand into water. She looked on whilst he splashed about, unsuccessful. Koi slipped from his grasp and darted off in all directions. Above them, autumn brought along another storm, a shine of lightning under its belly, and when light turned dim, chakra breaths came out and surrounded Suzuki in frenzied clusters. He looked surprised, gazing upon them as they came from darkening waters like solid globules whilst he was looking down. They touched him and turned a little yellow, filled up with his life force and floated about in the air, like fireflies, like flames, and unto him, autumn moths came, delirious in their own way, for he smelt like lilies. Excited, he leapt at them and captured one out of the rabble and ran to her. "Oka-san, Oka-san," he yelled, running to her. "I caught one. See." Then he stopped at the sight of her as a painting of fear mounted on the face of beauty. "Suzuki," she breathed out, visibly upset, "get rid of it. It's bad to carry it in your hands." Why? He asked, confusion evident upon his features, and felt the wings brush against his palms in gentle strokes. It was trapped in the tender prison securely. "It's bad omen," she said, loudly this time, and grabbed hold of his hand and jerked it. "It's turning into the devil's moth. I don't want you near it. Wash your hands," she said, frantic, and jerked his hand again harder this time, and the moth flew away into the darkness and they became one. Then she took him to the stream and washed his hands clean and wept, praying. She tended to become lachrymose when she was fearful of Kami's fury. Along the waves, night's ink was spilt and they turned deep gray. He could turn to his sherry non to see the koi hiding there, but he chose against it so as to not upset her any more, so when he looked to her after she had wiped his hands dry on her dress, she was all smiles again. She could be strange. Sometimes. "Don't be angry, Oka-san," he said, and, curiously, she looked to him in the way a young girl would. "I'm sorry. I'll get a gift for you." "Oh? I make charms for you, but you don't make anything for me," she said, kneeling by his side where the stream flowed, laughing, and her tone was softer than moth's wings against its harsher music. He stopped, deeply thinking of the things he could make. "You're a good boy, Suzuki, you're such a good boy," she said, her voice light, and clutched his face in her hands and kissed his love apple-shaded lips. Then she stood up and he did, too, and took his hand in hers. They walked away from the Kami sleeping in stones, their eyes still watching, never sleeping. Along the stones, sunlight floated like ghosts, coming and going. It seemed as though it would rain hard at night. He smiled, he liked rains. They stopped near the statue by the last stair, and he peered long at the boy deity's shrine that existed everywhere in the Uchiha village. He could have sworn that he saw one hiding in grass deep in the forest, too, when he went out to play in the meadow with his brother. Too bothered by not knowing, he asked, "Oka-san, who made this?" He pointed at the shrine and looked up at his mother's closed eyes and faintly smiling lips in the light that flew from night. Fainting, she was radiant. She whispered whatever it was that she wanted to say to the stone and looked back. "Madara-sama," she said, bending down and lifting him up into her arms that looked no less white than her dress. "Madara?" he asked and leaned his head against her shoulder. All about them, trees grew restless at the sight of Storm. "Our leader. He was here long ago before Leaf was made," she said, her countenance a little affected by blackness that bred behind trees. "They were far from Uchiha village, far from home. His brother died in war, so he made the shrines to pray for him. Some say that he's buried under one of the shrines." "No one's looked?" he asked, too curious to stop now. "No," she said, laughing. "There are so many. It's a lot of land to dig up. I'll look for it," he said with enthusiasm in his voice. "When I find it, I'd bring his brother's bones to you. You can make yucky medicine That'd make Oba-san happy. She's not happy with you. I don't like her." And then he was frowning and pouting in irritation. Mikoto stopped, surprise apparent on her face, and looked at the innocent frown in his brow and laughed, and the whole forest listened to her pretty tones. At this, his anger vanished piece by piece, and Sherry-non rippled up like blood-carrying bubbles to the foam of waves. "Oka-san, I love you," he said with the depth of a child's honesty, eyes brimming with love's ardor, and put a purple lily in her hair, at which, she smiled and kissed his cheek. Suddenly, she stopped by a well, into which the stream had broken. It was brimming full with water, and light from the full moon, like a crescent, concentrated at the lower half. Their faces, mirrored by water, floated above the crescent that gave the illusion of a smiling mouth drawn by a child's hand. "What do you see?" she asked, her smile murky, hair floating about his face like wings. "You and me. Little boy child, your heart grows wild. Little boy child, filled with love, beguiled." She began her whispers and walked to the Uchiha village, and he regarded, from over her shoulder, the pristine white that covered the smooth bend of her back. He was fascinated, and he watched lilies grow from the ground and smile up at him, after they had had their fill of fireflies. Night grew, but so did his love. Day was not enough to halt its progress. Night ended that one, yet so did all nights. One night she was there, next she was not. Perhaps that was the thing about nights, they opened the door into dream, peace, memory. Without dreaming, man was colorless. Nightmares, corruptions that had their place, they granted man fury whilst he slept. Fury needed to see things through to the end. There was a charm in their ugliness, a ferocity that a pretty dream could never give. There's much to remember, much. A night was coming here, too, and, when he looked up, he saw an oppressive sky falling down, a great vein bleeding out into the stagnant water the color could scarcely move, trapped by a storm in between a rapturous night and miserable morning. And before he could think of another thought, rain came down and drowned what little of morning remained. It was hard to tell night from storm anymore, they had become one. By his side, upon the tolerant shrub, red sasanqua bloomed. Their reds were striking in night. He plucked one and shoved it into his pocket thoughtlessly and looked ahead. In autumn, he confessed, she was only memory. In front of him, a large house stood against storm that would keep beating into its wood till spring. Behind it, mountains stood like dwarfed sentinels to protect it from the bitter cold that condemned it from north. It cast a deep shadow on this part of the forest when it was dusk. Now, storm had rendered its uniqueness obsolete. He waited, stood drenched in rain, felt wind come down at him. Hours passed by, and, at last, he saw the window on the left wall open. Then a man leaned out and waved a red cloth so energetically that he nearly fell out. Quickly, he pulled himself inside and bright light filled up the large window. This was it. Somewhere, an owl hooted whilst it rained, but, without wasting another beat, he flashed from his hiding place, and, in the next moment, he stood on the robust bough and knocked against the sturdy frame. A moment later, a frightened young man slid open the rice paper window, let him in, and slid it shut. "You sure picked a fine time to come here, Suzuki," he said, annoyed. "Why not come through the main door?" "I want it to be our secret," Suzuki replied, smiling with childlike mischievousness, and sat down by the sunken hearth. It was blazing hot, and the kettle hanging above it was letting out steam and echoing that familiar whistling sound, telling the room's owner that tea was ready to be poured out. "Ah, my charming Aji-sama, coming in through the window to court me," he shot back, a little dramatically, and walked to him, his delicate robes trailing on the over-polished wooden floor. "Why are you here? You said nothing in your missive," he said, sounding clearly agitated, and settled himself with the greatest care by Suzuki's side. Fire danced on his young face, and Suzuki could not help but notice that he was very young. Tokugawa Ajimaru, Ieyasu's second son, was a young man of 18. Though astute in some bureaucratic matters his father handled, he was rather cowardly. He spent most of his days pleasing Ieyasu rather than applying the iron focus his duty required. What he felt for his father was more fear, less admiration. A child born to a handmaiden, Lady Kogo, he never could gain his father's favor in a manner the third son, Hidetada, could. Perhaps the late Lady Saigo's whispers in Ieyasu's ears forever haunted Ajimaru's future days, a curse from the black tongue of a vengeful Yurei. A witch. He would often call her in frustration, for Ieyasu did not love him. No matter what he did, it was never enough to please his father, so all he received from Ieyasu were cold gestures and indifference. Suzuki did not think Ieyasu held any malice towards this son, but he could say for certain that he never wanted him. "Why?" Ajimaru asked again, in a voice which was strongly subdued and did not reflect his anxiety. "Has Ataka brought Meru to your house yet?" "He should have been here by now," he said, and watched with enormous satisfaction as fire's color filled Ajimaru's deathly white face so completely. How did you know?" "Father I never." "I know now," Suzuki replied, smiling in a triumphant manner. "Suzuki, you vile man. You're up to no good, aren't you?" Ajimaru accused, a slight shine of white teeth visible between his lips whose healthy flower-pink hue was characteristic of well-fed, dainty aristocrats, wringing his hands furiously, his eyes growing bigger. "Did you eavesdrop, you little mouse?" Suzuki remarked, but Ajimaru, though he wanted to reply, sprang to his feet and marched off to the door. Then, after opening it, he stuck his head out and looked about, and after making sure that no one had heard them, he raced back to the fireplace in a flurry of garments and slumped down on the cushion, utterly sorrowful. "Oh, Okami Oto-sama would kill me, he'd kill me dead." He lamented and rubbed his fingers across his sweat-adorned features, a fire burning the lightest yellow kikus in his garments that he looked more like a weeping ghost boy than a man. "Why, Suzuki? Why would you do this to me? Why? I never should have eavesdropped that fool of a servant. I never should have listened to him. He probably wants my seat." Yes, that's it. It's the seat, it's all his fault," he continued, his breathing heavy. "Oto-sama, forgive me." At this, Suzuki pressed his knuckled hand to his lips and started laughing. An angry color passed over Ajimaru's deep woodsy eyes, rendering them lighter in fire's light, and, out of his pocket, he drew a yellow silk handkerchief and wiped the shine from his face. Then he chased his eyes over into the corners of the large room, searching for specters, and stopped them on the shadows, about which vibrant light rose. The living room was clean, decorated with the finest objects the young man could afford. The sword stand, which Suzuki was sure Ajimaru seldom touched, that stood in the corner bore striking silver and gold patterns engraved into its wood, and, warmed by light, they shimmered, awaiting touch from a resolute hand. It had a place to hold a single sword, a neglected piece that exhibited a make-believe warrior's artifice. The urn in the alcove was filled with wilted red sasanqua. Ajimaru had not bothered watering them, so, almost dismayed by abandonment, they lost their color and gained a dismal pink hue sapped of vitality that made them stand out in winter's snow, right before their demise. Their stems, crooked and dried, cast a foreboding shadow on the scroll painting that hung behind the urn. Upon it, a spring pattern was drawn, which Ajimaru had told Suzuki he created in the honor of his late mother. When Suzuki stopped laughing, he gazed over to Ajimaru, whose countenance was fuming hot like the kettle. Begrudgingly, Ajumeru tended to his host beauties and lowered the kettle by adjusting the fish-shaped metallic sara that shone with a vivid earthen gray quality. As Ajumeru poured out a yellow-colored tea, Suzuki noticed that the sliding door to Ajumeru's room was partially up. The inside was sparsely brightened by the aid of a single lantern that bore deep red kikus as a customary symbol of his family or his father's family, for upon him, his father's sign was lightest, a fire without will. "You'd get both of us into trouble," he said, a furious pink rising in his soft cheeks, and thrust the cup into Suzuki's hand. The hot liquid slopped out and splashed onto Suzuki's fingers. He did not flinch. "Your hospitality is lovely," Suzuki remarked and looked at the cup that was partially filled with an aromatic tea. A yellow flower, which had lost its potent hue, floated upon the surface, its seeds black and bloated in hot water. "Forgive me," Ajumeru muttered, took a quick sip, and placed the cup down on the floor. "Tell me why you're here. My heart might fail not knowing." And he was looking to him, his face innocent white as a naive fool's. "I need something, and I need it now," he said and blew at the curling steam that sat atop the cup and sipped. Delicious, like caramel to the senses. It was sweetened with honey. "What?" he asked, still concerned, for he had an unpleasant feeling eating away at his gut like ravenous mice running amok in rice fields. "I want the old construction map of this house, one that shows everything." "Yes, the prison, too," Suzuki whispered, Storm's brightness penetrating through and spearing his changed eyes. Rain pelted the window and tore open a big hole into its rice paper. Now, it poured into the room, turned silver in rhythm with every flash. Ajumeru fisted his smooth robes and bent forward, his eyes like two translucent brown agates, panic-stricken beyond measure. His eyes moved between the door and Suzuki's calm face that he thought was too childlike and sweet for his aged demeanor, too. Ajumeru said nothing for several beats, turned, watched a trail of water come into the room through the torn rice paper slowly. He stopped, for breaths could not support his words, and turned to look Suzuki in the eyes. "Are you mad? You want to get Meru out, don't you? Oto-sama will have my head for this." "No, Suzuki, no. I can't do this. I sage help me, Suzuki, I can't," and he was trembling like a frightened child, his face covered in fresh sweat. "I'm not asking you to get me the map," Suzuki said, a palpable command in his voice. "I'm telling you to get it. I need it in 2 days and 1 night. If you don't give it to me, I'd tell your father how you managed to take care of that diplomatic mess you left in Kizo. I'm sure that'd be enough to make him very upset with you. Isn't that why you have your bureaucratic job? You wouldn't. Nothing's free. I did something for you. Now, it's your turn to do something for me. Besides," Suzuki paused, a smile, which showed a flavor of his prickly nature, appearing on his visage with torturous slowness, "Hide is handling the bandits. If he slips, it's a win for you. If he slips." "You make it sound so easy," he said quickly, his agitation increasing. "It is easy," Suzuki said, sipped tea, sighed out. "I'd clear up the unpleasant things in your head. Enjoy the tea." Then he raised the cup, smiled fully, drank all of it in a single breath as though it was sake. Ajumeru exhaled a long breath suddenly. He felt very tired. Spreading from Storm's belly, white lights stormed in, like uninvited shinobi, struck Suzuki over and over again, but the young Uchiha looked joyous as ever, and why wouldn't he? He was kicking him into Yomi's jaws to have his way. "Oto-sama's kind to your brother, almost sweet on him," Ajumeru said in a dejected tone and sat slumped, with his brow in his hand, his face and half his garments under shadow. "Well, that's what Yuki tells me. She says that there are some things only women see. I think she's mad." Suzuki said nothing, his ears wriggling, and his silence allowed Ajumeru to say more on the issue. "You should be afraid of your brother. I've heard mean things about him, nasty things. It's no wonder that Oto." He stopped and clamped his teeth together tightly to prevent himself from uttering anything disrespectful. "He can see my thoughts. Doesn't that frighten you?" "Lord Sage, I'm frightened," Ajumeru said and sat up straight, looking almost petrified. "Itaki isn't your business," Suzuki replied, holding his cup out as Ajumeru refilled it for him. "He's like a yokai. Chant from your mother's sutras. Think happy thoughts. He'd go away." The kettle was still warm, its bottom radiating heat, which he felt on his hand. Suzuki drank all of it again in one big gulp and held out his cup again and waited whilst Ojamaru poured out more of the tea that was cooling fast. Nii-sama this, Nii-sama that. He paused and picked up his cup from the floor. Now, it's Ataki? Have you lost your head? No, just my coins, 1 gold and 1 silver, he said and licked his lips, liking the unique, delicate honey flavor which was imparted to tea. I'll be the one in trouble. He has no shortage of O'Hara-sans or sons, he said bitterly and put down the half-full cup. He had lost his appetite. Oda-sama was killed on charges of treason. No Bayasu-san, too. He didn't shed a tear. My death wouldn't affect him, either. Women come and go. I see a new one every week, men, too. He's a spirited man. You don't know how I feel. Then Ojamaru spoke of nothing, looking into the fire and then his robes, lost as a child, as though searching for the reason as to why his birth robbed his kikus of a deeper shade. Perhaps his mother's hara was cursed, after all. Suzuki shoved his hand into his pocket and took out a scroll. Here, he said and held it out to him, it's a report on one of the outposts near Konoha. The biggest one. The head jonin's been slacking at the seals. They're weak. A surprise attack from the back would be enough to put a new flag in it. You can pay a little visit and pretend that you noticed something fishy. Hidetada will look like a fool. He's the one who appointed him, didn't he? You're very generous, Ojamaru replied, voice full of unmasked mockery, lips pressed into the tightest line that they looked like seams, but he took it from Suzuki's hand regardless and tucked it away inside his robes. I try my best, Suzuki said, sat up straight, made quick hand seals. Now, about your little head. Look at me. Ojamaru did not get the chance to protest, and, in the next moment, Suzuki was rooting through his memories the way a child rooted through grass in search of toys lost in last night's spirited play. Then, a beat later, he was out of his mind, not out of his sight, for his red was unnaturally prominent against Hearth's fire, too prominent. Why, what did you do? Ojamaru asked, holding his breast, breathing fast. I've put barriers on your mind, Suzuki said, unconcerned of Ojamaru's fears. When you get me the map, say this, little mouse, don't run up the hill, drop the bread for you had your fill. It'll clear your head. It'd be our little secret. You stop treating me like a child. Ojamaru said, blushing a deep, painful red, and hastily averted his gaze. What you want a pinky swear? I'd work, Suzuki said and smiled and held out his cup again. The kettle's empty. You drank everything, he said and looked down at his neglected teacup. A solid layer had formed over the surface, the tea had gone cold. Suzuki shook his head in mock sadness and put the cup down and looked at the rainwater that had stopped in its tracks against a particularly loose floorboard. The water was seeping down to somewhere. Are you going to get that cleaned? Oba-san tells me that when the storm's rot goes in, it ruins the whole house. Forget that. Are you staying? You can sleep in my room before Oto-sama knows you're here and leave before he knows, Suzuki said, and, in dimmed fire, his Sharingan's light was especially violent. You didn't hear your servant's footsteps. Why didn't you tell me? Ojamaru asked, panic overwhelming his face and turning it whiter than before, and sprang to his face so fast that Suzuki did not think he had it in him. Aren't you going to leave? You said that you didn't want him to. No, I'm going to wait for my wicked, no good brother. Suzuki cut across him, dragged himself away from the hearth, leaned his back against the wall. Then he closed his eyes and spoke no more. Behind Ojamaru's back, sky opened wide, an angry mouth, and storm intensified and shredded the rice paper. Slick sheets of rain came in, and water, bubbling upon impact, turned silver with the brightness in the sky. Ojamaru rushed to the window, his hair coming loose in the wind, robes flying, and closed the sturdier wooden frame from the inside. Truly terrified, Ojamaru sagged down to the floor and looked upon the young man who he knew was up to no good. Autumn was running, winter was chasing. Storm, angry, violent, vengeful, did not stop, but grew fiercer when the older one entered his domain, wearing his own flesh without illusions. A fresh thunderbolt upon the sounding air. The storm could not cease without his winter, his lulling love. This land, bountiful with flesh, beautiful with gore, was his truest master, his only kami, and he had served it like a kneeling mystic, propitiated Kami with bone and blood and body till he fell slumbering to his grave amidst leaves scattering in summer's ecstasy. He tiptoed the fine line between fanaticism and devotion, never crossing one or the other completely, yet, now, one side called, in tones rich, luscious. The seduction was greater than all seductions he had felt before, and he was tempted, very tempted to set free his impulses, relish its murky taste of joy in that insanity, which he nurtured, never murdered in the heart's heavenly orchard. There was corruption, a sinister ring to the voice, that plucked his memories like children plucked juicy love apples and ran like thieves. He had done it before, why not now, too? It was easy to dream of dreams that he had lived. What dreams he dreamt! Lush and lovely, his agony solemn and severe, his savagery. Moonful and beautiful mirror of his beauty, clothed in beauty. Fistfuls of flesh he ate and ate, gluttonous and fat and slimy, mothers lamenting their sons' transfiguration into devils with wings. Was it the seed that was of the father that ruined men, bearing red eyes and all, for it had ravaged her womb? Poor, sad little woman! As the breeze of challenge blew upon the house, it brought the perfume of rain and land to his nostrils, a sharp smell. It threatened to block his air passages again, but, at least, the noise was persistent to block out the ringing in his damaged ear. Lucky? Time would tell, and time was no one's friend, not even his. Now, he looked upon the man whom he had served since childhood, dressed in signs of servility? No, that was not in his heart, for he served life and its will. He was born to serve. Assist, he would correct the course of his near heretical thought, but was there a difference? In all his life, he could not say he had found it. The lantern was bright, yellow, its light that fell upon the richest robes, upon which kikus were embroidered, facing a rising red sun. They were of the deepest red, one which he had never seen. Well, save his clan's reds, those reds were deeper still, but, in their deep nature, treachery had germinated. They lacked the calm that possessed these reds. This will not work, he spoke, at last, wearied. He wanted to leave here. The man distressed him. After all, it was difficult to look into the mirror to see an older face when the mist was away. And you should not be the one to dictate in our dealings, lest you desire both of my hands on you again, one to slit your throat and one to slit your cock. And let me tell you a little secret, no one enjoys the company of a eunuch in bed or battle. No matter how lovely he may look, he spoke, a smile almost touching his lips in wild delight, and stood straight, light bending downwards at sharp angles about his robes that gave him the impression of a man set alight. You asked of me to bring this fool here to reminisce about bed and battle and the eunuchs that may decorate them? Your interests are bizarre and inspiring, he spoke, irked, though he appeared calm to his master's eyes. But of course. Which man would deny the charm of battle and heat of bed? Perhaps one that was born with the heart of a woman, but such men elicit boredom amongst friend and foe. Is that not true, my dearest friend, Meru? He asked, turning a little so that the light captured the side of his sharp face in intimate detail. Meru, bound to a sturdy chair, looked up, but said nothing. Instead, he pressed his lips aggressively together to keep his thoughts from tumbling out. Both men could say with complete conviction that Meru had nothing nice to say. Never have I had the pleasure of eunuchs, but I can always create one out of you. Let us call it a social experiment on the importance of being spiritually fluid. You can set the trend, my dog. It is a shame that you are very unsightly, he spoke and walked to the restrained man whose back was bowed. He was silent. How is your dear wife? Last I saw her, she was writhing in my bed, hoping that I would grant you a permit into that foul samurai land. Thunder chased his words and shattering noises filled the dimming room. The lantern was almost out of oil, its flame shivering against winter's half-waking instruments. Samurai land, a land cold and vast, draped in white. Men from shadow villages crossed its borders and took refuge in the villages scattered across the treacherous mountains that stretched on like great frozen waves as far as the eyes could see beyond that even. It was hard for shinobi who bore their villages' marks, with pride on their brows, to find their way into the depths of snow that fell all year round. The land found joy and respite in autumn only once, and for it, autumn was its greatest spring. Did you whip her for spreading her legs to me? She told me that your temper is unpleasant, he spoke, and, in a sudden fit of anger that gripped him, Meru spat at him, though he missed his mark. When a man fails to spit in his foe's face from this up close, he has truly brought shame upon his ancestors. He spoke, unamused, looked upon the man who sat sick and heaving in the chair. Still no answer. Speak, churl. He spoke, his voice biting at the cold air, sharp. If you do not speak, I will ask this man here to find your family. It is not hard to find a woman and few children. With heart and conviction, man can find Kami. And when he finds them, he will give them to me, and I will keep your lovely wife and one daughter that is pretty till I grow weary of them, and give your other daughter and son to hungry men. And they can keep them till they grow weary of them. Is that what you want, to have your children be mounted by hungry men, 10 at a time? I shall even allow you a comfortable place to witness the spectacle. By Kami's will, I will, and I shall. Nothing. Meru sat quietly in the light that smelt malodorous to his senses. The shadow the man cast upon him was nothing more than air over his body. His fear was beaten, perhaps his spirit's death had led to its murder as, without fear, men forgot to live. Hide tada! He called out, command heaviest in his voice, and, a moment later, a young man of 17 came into the room. Lantern's light showed his face soft, boy-like, his hair, black like his father's. He shared his eyes, too, though they lacked the hard aspect his father possessed. Yes, Oto-sama. He asked and bowed his head. Take him away, he spoke, and temper was visible in his brow. Hide Tada nodded and called a man named Tadao into the room, who untied the tired man and struggled to keep him upright. He could tell that Meru had little will in him to stand. Do not give him water, he spoke, casting Meru a glance that was uncharacteristically hateful. Yes, Ieyasu-sama, Tadao said, nodded, and walked out quietly. Ieyasu, shifting so that light went along his face, was returning the other man's gaze with a slow, unreasoning anger. Then he smiled, and his smile was least sincere. Why can you not bring me one good news, Itake? You only bring yourself. Sometimes, I just imagine that you are useless. Would you agree? Ieyasu asked, eyes seeing the young Uchiha's face cast in sobriety that concealed many aspects of his troublesome nature. I want to talk of Tsunade's ruination, for she's steadfast in her quest to ruin me utterly, Itake spoke, looking akin to a ghost from theater cast out, as if he had come to play again. Your generosity? Is this the glad tidings I have awaited? Ieyasu mocked expressionlessly and walked to his table and sat down in the chair that was unusually large, and, though he was a tall man, it made him appear gigantic. She taught Kikyo her ninjutsu. Did she tell you? Itake spoke, his voice whispering in the room in a manner as though there was a legion of him in the shadows, disturbing Storm's turmoil. Ieyasu looked up from the letter spread out on the table, an interest evident upon his features, framed agreeably between long black hair. When he said nothing, Itake continued, it is not allowed to teach shinobi's jutsus that aid leaf. She did. The girl nearly killed me. When did she teach it to her? She never told me. The scroll. I have it with me, yet it is locked away by a binding seal only she knows. Did you know? Still looking at him, Ieyasu nearly smiled. Say what you want to say, he spoke, taking out the brush from the inkpot to finish the letter. You have a tendency to whisper things into my ears. Which, I must confess, I do find irresistible sometimes. How much did Kisame tell you? I want to know, Itake spoke, and like a daemon in a man's disguise, he crossed the light and cut off the rays falling upon himself, casting a shadow so thick on the wall that it appeared blacker than the storm-tormented night outside. Do you think I was dishonest with you? You are as insistent as lovers tonight, Ieyasu spoke, writing. He told me that Isabuya was bartered off to Yagura in return for money and services to cripple Cloud's reign and destroy Jayaki. Leaf's council did that without the military council's knowledge. Dogs. If they gave away more. Well, then he did not trust me with the knowledge. Why? I think he did not trust me for he did not trust you. Why must you bring this up every other week when you know the answer? Itake, do you enjoy being like naive boys? I do find you occasionally charming in this disguise. Ieyasu looked up once, his eyes gleaming against the lantern with meaning, and then he went back to his task of writing. Danzo will not give you the daemon. If he even has it, Itaka spoke and came closer and stood by the chair, his shadow darkest upon the wet ink in the letter. The bandits that caught wind of the Okamai girl's treachery gather round Leaf. It is only a matter of time they get in touch with him and ruin the greater unification which you have dreamt of for years. What will you do when that happens? Ieyasu pushed the brush back into the inkpot and leaned back into the chair. Before him, a quiet room stared back, one which the lantern did not affect. A darkness existed about the floor, dark as blood, which was torn open like flesh when lightning came in. Then the room bled out in white streams. Martyrs, they were martyrs in greater will's fire. Ieyasu, deep in thought, did not speak, and, taking advantage of his silence, Itaka bent down and whispered into his ear, "The councilman you detest comes from the capital, and he means trouble. Danzo has called him to Leaf. He wants more trouble, and Tsunade hopes to limit your hold through this trouble. I ask for your presence in Leaf. It would end the matter quickly and make my task easier." Then he backed away, and, after drawing a long breath, Ieyasu let out a short laugh that echoed in the room. "You are sweet tonight," he spoke and poured out a cup of light sake. "Get that scroll open before I come. I want to know what it says." Itaka nodded and stood erect, light going down his face, blending perfectly into the white, and when Ieyasu looked up, he could see him and the loveliest part of him, enshrined in the light's architecture, white, all white, sublime white, winter white. Ieyasu looked away and picked up the letter from the table. All it needed now was a stamp from his family. "Your brother is with Orochimaru," Ieyasu spoke and applied the red kiku-shaped seal on the paper with the help of his chakra and watched it dry. "You should be kinder to the boy. He is very sweet." Quietly, without saying a word to Ieyasu, Itaka left the room as easily as shadows, and, outside, Storm's restless nature found a sort of calm in the midst of tall mountains. This night felt longer, stronger. Brightened by a full moon, night let Storm flee. The younger one felt the older one before he opened the door. His eyes opened and saw Itaka standing white like clay toys in the light. Nervously, Orochimaru bowed, said, "Itaka-sama," and left the room in a hurry as though he was being chased down by assailants. Silence, strangling quietness pervaded in Itaka's presence that Sasuke could hardly hear the storm. Fury burning like corpses, bleeding like children, blurring like storms went through him, and, all of a sudden, he wanted his brother gone to the ends of earth, and never return unto him as ghosts did to haunt men. Inside the room, the hearth had gone cold as corpses. Orochimaru was so distressed that he forgot to rekindle it. He had spent his time walking about the room, sweating, pacing, whispering. Sasuke could not blame him, but he was desperate. Poor boy. At last, his wicked brother spoke, though he wished he had not. "You were sweet when I brought you gifts and you smiled. Now, you are thankless. No matter what I do to please you, you are thankless. Why? Have I not done enough to earn a bit of your love, respect? Fuck you." Sasuke hissed, unamused, turning his face to the light that escaped Orochimaru's room in long broken pieces. "Foul language and in my presence? You know I do not like it," Itaka spoke calmly, without moving, feeling that any harshness may invite more of his siblings' anger. The girl had ruined him, and, at that moment, he held nothing but the deepest contempt for her in his breast. "When I look at you, I see red," Sasuke said, his tone harsher than before, his brother a shadow in shadows. "Get out. I don't want to see you, not now, not ever." Though Sasuke had no intention to retaliate, his fury got the best of him. You see, his brother was a grave digger who had dug out several graves and filled them to the top, not with bodies, but with blood. "Why do you challenge me?" Itaki asked, and, this time, he drew near, and Sasuke wanted to shrink into the wall to escape his shadow's grasp, unsuccessful. "Is my love not enough for you? I did what you asked of me. I allowed the foul children into your team. I let your friend remain your friend. Yet no matter what I do, you still choose to challenge me? I can only endure your anger for so long till I find one of my own to match yours. Do you want me to choose? You will regret my choice." And at this confession, shadows, huddled into the corner, wriggled about like moths twisting larvae in glee. "You give me nothing but grief. You won't let me leave, you won't let me live. I won't do what you want me to do." Why don't you kill me? It'd be for the best if you killed me, Suzuki said honestly and felt Itaka's hand on his head. He was stroking his hair back, and he hated it. You child, how could you even think of something so vile? I love you with all my heart. Looking upon you, it fills me with a joy that cannot be measured, Itaka spoke, his words sweeter than the sweetest honey, but Suzuki detested them with equally bitter intensity. Your stubbornness breaks my heart. Itaka paused and lifted Suzuki's chin with the fingers of his free hand and touched his cheek with the other. Look at the darkness that decorates your eyes. Why do you ruin yourself for the dead? I want you looking the same, like a sweet and beautiful child, free of distress. All smiles and shiny eyes. If you do not listen, I will be forced to do what you will not like. You will not, I promise you this. Itaka's eyes turned red with violence, shurikens cutting slowly like butcher's knives, as if awakening from a dream, like the twinkling of stars from a slumbering radiance. Suzuki's responded. My conditions, your conditions, back to the same bullshit? You're a liar. Suzuki shot back, flowers burning to bits in the deep pits. You kept Suijutsu for yourself, you fucking liar. How much did you pay him, huh? It's no wonder I couldn't get anything done. You don't fool me, but I bet you fooled the clan. I'd never forgive you. What are you hiding? Did you put swords into their backs, you traitorous fuck? Then Suzuki bent his head, his cheeks like pieces of love apples within the hair. Sometimes, I wish your tongue was sweeter, Itaki remarked and ceased his caresses. Curse that woman, the words singed his tongue and almost slipped out. It was no use. Suzuki was so angry that, no matter what he said, he would not listen. Stay here if you wish, or come with me. Make your choice, but mind your tongue and mind. If you do not come, I will take you home regardless and confine you to a single room if I must. There you will live. I will come by in the evening and we will eat lovely things, and that is all what your life will be. No one will miss you, for there will be no one left to miss you. Succumbing to his original intention that was ruined by anger, he stood up, but said nothing, matching his older sibling's anger beat for beat. You are a good boy, Itaka spoke, bent his head, kissed Suzuki's brow, and, now, he was smiling, looking at the younger one with lovely fondness. You may not know, but I do. When winter comes, and it will come soon, I want to see your ills forgotten with season one way or another. Come. Then Itaka turned away and left the room, and he followed. Outside, by the main door, Ieyasu stood, a scroll in his hand. He held it out and gave it to Suzuki, who smiled in reply. Our secret, Ieyasu spoke, without looking to Itaka, and smiled a deep and warm smile. By his side, Ojimaro looked as frightened as ever. He wanted to stay, but Itaka pulled him away from the house, and, now that storm had lost its vigor, Suzuki knew that a long journey lay ahead of him. It was into the night's deeps that storm went quiet as the house. There was no one, not a sound, to meet her. Since her darling was not here, the library's door that led to the garden was closed with a secure padlock. She leaned her head sidelong against the wall and gazed upon her son's painting that still hung in the alcove. The loss of colors inside Shadow's belly was evident, but, without Sherry-non, she still saw a red moth bleeding to its death in winter. Red invaded white deeply till it lost its hue and dimmed to pink, but it stopped in its tracks too soon to leave a mark, and, up in the sky, Storm, most beautiful boy-child in garments light and flowing, slept inside the open samsara eye rendered in Kami's purple, a smile on its pretty red mouth, a purple lily in its tiny curling hands, a sharing and bearing large crow sitting by its side, gazing down upon its countenance, a fever in its red, moon glowing about its blackest head. With a sigh, she rose up to her feet, her old bones unable to carry her like this anymore, but, unlike her youth, her stubbornness remained. She walked through the empty corridor, not gazing upon brightness that struck the lattice and bent the structure's shadows across her path. Little distractions. A hesitance swelling in her heart, she opened Itaka's room and a long strip of light fell across the rack in which he arranged his scrolls. Above it, a clock hung, and she noticed that its minute hand was slowing down. The room was clean, but empty. She did not know what she expected to see, but its sight left great sorrow in her heart. Carefully, she closed the door and made her way to the garden. The storm was receding fast, and, by the time she opened the main door, letting out entrances light into night. A full moon glowed beautifully in the sky, and, about it, rings of whites and greys spun. Breathing deeply the air that was fragrant, she walked to the shining pathway and sat down on the well that was closed with a thick wooden cover. Then she gazed upon the bud that had grown to maturation, and, right before her eyes, moon kissed its top and it opened wide, smiling. This was the last seed you gave me. I planted every single one, and, she paused, Sherry Non rushing faster than her grief to reflect moonlight, they are all gone now. It is gone, my darling. And I still cannot see you, not without the Sherry Non that hurts me. Your mother has lost her eyes without you. Silence. Only wind. Like a shade, he came from the past her Sherry Non had kept and appeared before her eyes, and he wore a kind smile, like threads of scarlet his lips, like snow his cheeks, partially shaded by night deep hair, and he gave her the purple lily seeds, said that he had brought them from the heart of their ancestral lands. He was born at the end of January, winter's peak. Yet, now, he stood before a dusking sky, autumn's streak, reds from war in the sky called unto him, and he left her all alone, and she never saw him again. I miss you, she whispered, at last, grieving, I miss you, my son. You took all of my heart. You never gave it back. Why do you not come to me? I love you so much. I cannot bear this not anymore. Your last memory is gone, and I fear that I will lose you, too. She touched her eyes, Sherry Non shimmering the way it did when she was young, praying. When Mikoto felt the chakra germinate in her womb, it was the day her oldest son had perished. She had prayed for so long that she was overjoyed beyond measure. The boy was strong, and he ate much from her mother's weak hara. Mikoto, a half-breed, was undeserving of her youngest son who was kind to take her as his bride. She forbade him from ever teaching his sons to call Mikoto Oda-sama. Though she could tell that he was saddened by her indifference to his wife, he agreed. Much to her dismay, Mikoto could not nurture the firstborn son fully and bore him well before his time, at summer's peak in June. The boy, at birth, was tiny, but beautiful. Though his body was small enough to fit in both her hands, he was strong, as though he came into this world with a purpose. He did not weep much and stayed in her chakra's protection for several months before he gained enough strength to look at the world about him with big, curious eyes that were much like her son's. She wanted to name him after her oldest, but her youngest had chosen a name for him already. Her youngest and Mikoto named the firstborn Itake, a quiet child, spoke little and filled the mold her oldest left behind, for he looked like him, he looked just like him. Itake, her oldest, had returned to her, but he was cold as though winter had sustained him through his spirit's rebirth. He liked autumn moths, fed upon them like devils in play, a habit she had always loathed, carried a coarseness in his countenance that was enough to mar her oldest son's beauty. There was, if she were honest, a corruption in him that never went away, it only gained more power every winter, but she prayed for the lost son in him, and, albeit he was around, his indifference made her miss his demi-hour that he had left behind in the previous life. She heard the rustling of leaves, and, in spite of being old, she could, without looking, tell the way the feet moved as to who it was. Why are you here, Tsunade? She asked, putting to rest her three kunao-like Mangekyo Sherry Non pattern. Tsunade came to the gate, stopping in anxiety for a moment, and then she walked into the garden that was surprisingly lush in spite of the harsh weather. She stood a few feet from the old woman, away from the moonlight, who looked as though she wanted nothing to do but pray tonight. Rao-sama, she began, closing her fingers into fists, feeling a cold meet her breast cruelly, I want to speak to you about the land's lease. It's ending. It would be for the best if Ieyasu. If Ieyasu does not get it. Rao forestalled her, laughing. If he does not, then should you. She looked at her, and her eyes turned red, angry. Tsunade did not know what to say. This well you see here, we do not tell our children that Madara-sama made it, that he made it before your leaf stood on these hallowed grounds. We lie because you ask us to lie, and Itake? Itake listens to your lies. He sees truth in them. Perhaps I am cursed by my oldest. I deserve it. Rao looked away, and there was silence between them once more. She sat like this for some time, utterly silent, as if she was lost. Then when Rao heard the chimes, she spoke again, though she chose not to look at her. Mufweu, my oldest, he He perished in war. He did not want to be in the military, but he was my firstborn. I was stubborn. I wanted him to be our clan's pride. He was a brilliant boy, you see. He invented two of our clan's most prized jutsus at a tender age of 14. It would have been a waste to not make him lead us to keep him home, close to my heart. Then Rao was quiet, hand upon her breast, eyes upon the lily that swayed, happy. Tsunade did not know what to say. He did not want to fight your wars, she began, voice delicate, and Tsunade could tell that there was a slight hitch in between the words that her voice found hard to overcome. He wanted to stay, yet I sent him out. I was cruel to him, and he never came back. He never. And her words stopped like death, lips coming together brutally to keep her emotions from coming out. Then Rao stood up, eyes upon the moon, entranced. He was such a beautiful boy. Gentle boy. Beautiful like my Suzuki. Gentle like my Oda-sama. Can you imagine? She asked, and Tsunade had nothing on her tongue to answer. I did not even get to see his face. They burned his body upon death and threw his ashes in our village's stream. They told me that the war had ruined his face, that there was nothing to see, nothing. You, Rao hissed, her voice warmed dangerously by fury, you ruined my son. Your grandfather ruined my son. Your leaf ruined him. You have ruined my Atake, too. You have poisoned his soul. He is cruel. He only sees Leaf's shadow, nothing more. Does this not rattle your spirit that you only eat? And she stood trembling, one half of her frame stricken by moon, the other, afflicted by night. Rao-sama, I did what you asked of me. The land. The land does not belong to you, Rao cut her off, her anger's intensity not abating. It is Suzuki's now, and he will never give it to you. That was my youngest son's will, and I will uphold it. And you did nothing for me. You granted Ataka power to keep your own. You are not innocent, but you like to pretend. Leave my house, I need to pray. Then Rao turned towards the flower and clasped her hands together and started praying, and Tsunade was left with little choice but to leave here. When Tsunade reached her office, it was empty as a graveyard. There was not a soul in sight. Shizun had left a glass cup, filled to the top with sake, on the table. She sat down in the chair and leaned on the table and took deep breaths, burying her head in the crook of one arm, curling her fingers about the glass cup that was tempting. Taking one sip, she grimaced and threw the cup across the table. The sake flew from the cup and splattered across the large table and spilled from the edges in fast droplets. Closing her eyes, she sat upright and breathed in deeply. This was not how she had expected it all to end. In the next moment, Tsunade heard footsteps and anger galloped alongside her blood with renewed intensity. Shizun, leave me be. She stopped as soon as she opened her eyes, for in the door stood a young Uchiha elder she had seen only few times. I am Yamato, one of the elders, he said, with a smile, and looked at the chair. May I? Tsunade nodded, and he took the chair opposite of her. It is late, she said, studying his face that betrayed nothing save a smile that looked dishonest. What brings you here in the dead of the night? I am sure Itaka can. Itaka will make matters worse for you. Yamato cut across her and appeared immediately apologetic. Forgive my rudeness. I can be hasty in speech, but I think we both want the same thing. And what is that? Tsunade asked, wary, as a storm was ripening again in the skies, unreachable and a sign and bad omen. A change in Uchiha leadership, he said, and, whilst storm dazzled her eyes, she was stunned. Chapter 80, Trouble, Trouble, Trouble. When noise from the inside turned louder, the world slept to silence. Tonight, it was all storm, rising to a sepulchral register. It locked it all up and put a firm lid atop the heart's barrow. How hard was it to open it back up? Just a crack? Up and up in the sky, light, argent and gelid, lost to storms that enveloped the land with wings beating on sleeping mounts. Faceless they watched, yawned at the forest that wept in fervent gasps. Moon, night's envy, from between storm's plumes gazed upon the corrosion of souls, a slow rot. Uncaring, of the child's sorrow, it only looked pretty, for it made the child so sad. San, that hurts. He burst out, distressed, and his leg jerked. The wound was deep, red like cut-up white fish, hurting like fire. He had been careless. He was a child. Children were careless. Suzuki, if you don't hold still, I won't be able to close this up. It might get infected, Itaka said, holding a tailor's needle in hand, his fingertips rouged red. The tailor's needle was surprisingly effective in sewing up wounds, though the process did require a precise hand and perceptive eye for stitches that held the wound's edges firmly together, without breaking. "Nii," he pleaded, gasping between hiccups, his tear-decorated lips and cheeks red. "Stop it, Suzuki, don't move." Itaka scolded, his tone very harsh, and bent his head to look at the wound. His shurinan was more severe than the freshly bleeding flesh. Suzuki could see inside the skin that was torn open, a crushed flower on his knee. He fell silent. Tonight, his brother frightened him more. Suzuki sat on the chair, his little legs dangling above the matted floor. Itaka sat cross-legged on the floor, back bent forward. Though still a boy of 14, Itaka was quite tall for his age, and his shadow loomed large and grotesque above Suzuki's on the wall. Itaka held the torn skin and applied crisscrossing stitches to the wound. Suzuki chose to look outside the window that Itaka had left open. It was night, and sky was gathering together a little storm that was innocent, naive, young, and when night breeze touched the fire that burnt in their father's lantern, Suzuki saw red go across his brother's nape that was white as winter's sleep. The needle hurt when it pierced his skin, left little red bubbles on the pores. It felt as though he was being bitten by spring insects that had come forth from the ripened soil to feast on his flesh, but he said nothing, drank back the tears, swallowed down the sobs. A few signs of pain sparkled on his cheeks in the light, his brother could see, but he said little to ease his worries. "I don't have any medicine to reduce your pain," Itaka said, his voice strange as if he was speaking to himself, not Suzuki. "I told you not to go outside, but you don't listen. Look what you've done. This will hurt you. Why don't you listen? You never listen to me." And he sent a reproachful glance toward Suzuki, his red eyes half bright, half shadow, red glowing behind the black of his smooth hairs. Suzuki said nothing. At last, Itaka was done with the task. The thread of silk was sewn into the skin. It would have to be taken out when they reached home, otherwise, it might leave a mark. He wiped the wound clean with a wet cloth, and then smeared it with a sickly yellow ointment. "Careful," he said, and rose up to his feet and watched as Suzuki climbed down from the chair beneath his shadow's manifestation. "Go and lie down. Keep your legs straight." Suzuki did not answer, quiet like nights, benign like infant storms. Itaka saw red emerge in his pretty eyes, crowned by curled lashes, a color whose ferocious calm heralded a mighty storm. Suzuki bent down, reached for the little toy on the futon, and clasped it to his breast. In the child's wild hair, fire threads danced, interwoven with black by an intimacy that was primal. With a sigh, Itaka turned from Suzuki. He left the room and the house. Outside, rain began falling down upon the foliage that looked all but black, without the shurinan that went from his eyes. He stood in the door, held out his hands and washed them clean. He gazed up, watching a brightness storm had patched onto the dark of night. His journey home would be delayed. When Itaka returned to the room, he found Suzuki standing tiptoed by the open window, eyes nearly closed and lips drawn between teeth. Rain droplets, which had fallen inside, by his feet shimmered at the light from the hearth's fires. Craning his neck, he reached up just high enough to pluck something from the bush that grew outside. The branch stretched and whipped back and swayed, a smile descended on Suzuki's lips, red like summer's remains, toy dangling from his arm. When he turned and looked to his older sibling, he hid away the flower of his smile in his fist, and, quietly, walked to the futon and sat down, keeping his legs straight. Then Suzuki played, but he did not look back to his older sibling. Itaka did not say a word, walked to the window, closed it. Then he, too, went to the futon and sat down by Suzuki's side. The little one was quiet, busy twisting the string round his forefinger again and again. He had become quite apt at that trick over the past few weeks. They sat like this, quietly, fire crackled in the hearth, burning against a winter that stood knocking on land's door. "What's in your hand?" Itaka asked, unable to resist the urge to see that which was hidden in the child's fist. "Show me," he persisted, sweetly. With great reluctance, Suzuki opened his fist and showed to Itaka what was in it, red sasanqua. It was fresh, newly bloomed, its petals robust, unfurling in the palm, its hue deep like a dead woman's life frozen in snow. It would not last, would find death at winter's threshold, would marry silence as winter foretold. Is that why you went outside? Itaki asked, his shadow slithering along the boy's countenance, threatening. Suzuki bent his head down but said nothing. I don't want you going outside again, not without me. Do you understand? Itaka said, watching the shadow slip about the boy's wound, like a serpent bleeding out dirty blood. You're mean, Suzuki gasped out in between a long-drawn, quivering sob, tightening his fist. Oka-san wasn't mean. She's gone. She's not coming back. Why don't you understand? Itaka said, gazing upon tears gathering together into large droplets at the edge of the boy's eyes, his father's light, an oblation, trapped inside. I hate you, whispered Suzuki, at last, and tears went down his cheeks, and they looked something like stars and something like morning dews, quivering pretty on his cheeks. Itaka breathed in deeply, realizing that he should not have spoken that way to the child. All right, I won't take it from you. I promise, Itaka said, bent down, and kissed Suzuki's sweat-flecked brow. Unconvinced, Suzuki looked up, blinking. You won't? He asked, sniffling, hiding away the flower. I won't, he said, smiled, wiped clean Suzuki's plump cheeks with the back of his fingers. But you'd have to make me a promise, too. You won't go outside without me. You promise? Itaka nodded, and, reassured of his brother's honesty, Suzuki nodded in answer. You're a good boy, Suzuki, you're such a good boy, Itaka said and bent down and kissed Suzuki's cheeks, and that dawned the ghost of blush across his countenance, touched by the hue of ripened love apples. He was a little boy, and he was happy. How easy it was to make children happy. Easier than spring made happy the flowers. Then Itaka took the child into his arms, as to a place of safety, and storm came down upon the land, hitting out like the little Kami's wrath, and storms were meant to die when they began to weep. Nii-san, tell me the story. Suzuki said, looked up, and a big smile changed the character of his features, his blush was deepening amidst autumn's mercy. Story. Itaka said, looked down, light moving about his mutable eyes like phantoms, his sherry-non had mounted upon the blacks, unseeing. That he stopped, pouted when he could not remember, bounced a little when he remembered it again, that Indra won. Yamatai-koku? You liked it? He asked, smiling, cupping his hand under Suzuki's chin. The child was beside himself, fire gathering, beating, burning inside his eyes in answer to the siblings. Dervishes, if they sang, they were meant to sing, too. In the lands to the west, Himiko ruled, he began, his reds shimmering like lesser fish in Suzuki's a shaman priestess, she bewitched men with sorcery, but she brought peace to the lands. She had a son by a hijiri. She named her firstborn Kasai. Some say that he changed his name to Indra after he was betrayed by his father, who chose the younger sibling as his heir that was a ninja shaman, like he was. Himiko had died by then, and the rule of the land went back and forth between the two quarreling brothers. Why didn't they make up? Suzuki asked, visibly distressed by the thought of two brothers fighting bloody wars over something as trivial as lands. Itaka gave forth a soft laugh and brushed his finger against Suzuki's brow. I don't know, he said, a smile in his voice, but if it makes you feel better, I won't fight with you over something as silly as lands. Happy that his brother would never quarrel with him, Suzuki began smiling again. Indra shed the blood of his foes there, he said, turned the lands red, and from deep inside the soil, Shinju sprouted. Its flower had the sherry non you and I have. It bore him a fruit, too, and he ate it. He ate it? Suzuki asked, tilting his head, surprised. The little house shook, but the storm was playing sweetly with the land tonight. Yes, he ate it, and that's what granted him the sherry non, Itaka said, brushing Suzuki's hair from his brow, peeling the graying shadow from his skin. It was autumn's peak when the great battle between the brothers was fought. Chakra breaths came out from the earth where he spilled his own blood, and at that moment, chakra breaths bubbled out from beneath them and touched Suzuki's cheeks and kissed them. They turned yellow, not deep yellow like summer poppies, but mild yellow like autumn's sun which mist concealed. They were not many, yet they danced a dance of passion about the boy, and enchanted by their child's play, he smiled. "Nii-san, look, fireflies," he said, excitement growing like songs in his voice, and poked at the round orb that vibrated in madness at the touch. "They come for purple lilies, but—" Itaka broke off, and his words became a part of silence that was unneeded in the tumult created by the child's sweetest laughter. Bewildered by the spectacle, the older sibling looked on whilst the breath kissed long the child's lips, as though stealing the hue, mimicking its honesty, turning red to bursting. Autumn's smell had risen in the room from the deep, roused by Storm's divinity, and Itaka did not know what to do. Spellbound, yet frightened, he snatched the child's hand away from the breath, his shurikens rising up to the task to cut up the kindly children Earth had sent forth for the child that was hers, always hers. "Don't touch it," he said, gasping, trembling, clasping tightly the child unto himself. "Why?" Suzuki asked, voice muffled by Itaka's shirt. "Oka-san said she'd take me to the Kasai lands and show me more The breaths, sensing the malevolence in the older one, scattered like alarmed children. They then vanished one by one, and, upon their leaving, Itaka's heart calmed like winter's calm. "The lands aren't ours, Suzuki. Not anymore." He whispered and kissed the child's head and passed his hand down the small of the child's back. "And these wisps could hurt you. Don't go near them." Moments passed like this in a silence which was embracing, and Suzuki spoke, quite suddenly, "I'd be brave like Indra and fight the men who killed Oka-san Oto-sama. I won't forgive them." His voice was solid, unwavering, quite unlike his own. Itaka uncoiled his arms from around Suzuki and looked upon his eyes, and he felt as though he was being swallowed up by the little boy's red and its ferocity. Now, after many years, the lands had changed. No longer were they his father's, but they were under the sway of foes, as Suzuki would call them. "Close the window, Suzuki, and come here to me," his brother spoke from behind, and his voice, like a fish, struck the air that was water, and then it was silence from the loudest storm. Suzuki looked upon the sky that bled darkly once more. The storm's brow was disturbed whilst about its domain cloudy shinobi formed. It would not take long the storm that was young to arm itself to the last tooth, to call upon its armaments and strike down where it would hurt deep, hurt quick, hurt the most. Then, after taking in the fragrant air, he closed the window, secured it from the inside, and turned away. In the back of the room, his brother sat dignified by the low table, and about him red dully danced in air, almost appearing like awkward patches stitched deeply into the wounds. Slowly, Suzuki walked to him and sat down by his side. His older sibling was writing a missive, an official matter, which were many, that required a sense of urgency from him, but his long fingers that seemed soft, as though they belonged to one with a delicate constitution, moved with an unhurried purpose. His brother enjoyed dragging things and people. The red from the lantern ghosted about the white of his brother's hand, never truly touching, existing in a separate reality yet in the same space. Then, whilst his sibling was creating the most perfect letter, he stopped and looked unto Suzuki and smiled, and from where Suzuki sat, his smile had the depth of sincerity. "You are quiet. You do not want to speak? It is all right. You can rest, and we can talk in the morning." Itaka spoke to his younger sibling, his smile soaking in the red the lantern issued forth that, now, his lips were redder than red. Then, when Itaka shrank his eyes in the manner of a sober yet playful elder, they twinkled curiously. They seemed not to belong to him, as though he had stolen them from a man for whom he held the sentiments of scorn. No, his brother's eyes had always been this way, enchanting, as though they cradled a world of their own, and in the slain blacks and restrained reds of their space, all of Suzuki's world existed. It was a frightening thought, one which required of him to exorcise himself from their daemons, but he was not prepared to flee, not just yet. Suzuki looked on, and the eyes, a compendium of tricks, Itaka turned them away and returned to the task of creating letters. The older one did not speak, his smile staying like an unwelcomed guest upon the bow of his lips, about which red traced a solid pattern. His brother, Itaka, was a strange one, always had been. His brimble visage, out of the common, was the cause of much of his allure. It tricked all. To the onlookers, he was agreeable, perfect, beautiful in appearance, Yet his seemings were not the best indications of his true sentiments, for, beneath them, fluxes and refluxes of danger circulated. Liar, he was not to be trusted. A sudden assault storm struck out at the stricken land whose torment was only beginning, and Itaka paused in the task and spoke, his words pretty and soft like his countenance, "We cannot stay here too long. The storm could last for days and nights. We should leave as soon as it softens." Sasuke said nothing, thinking, looking. His older sibling did not seem upset by Sasuke's silence, his smile taking on an amused quality little by little. The red met his fairest skin tone lightly, left a mark as if concluding its compliments on the frosty bride's person. "Do you want me to tell you a story?" Itaki asked whilst he wrote down the final line, the white scroll beneath his whiter fingers, blighted with ink and shadow. "You liked them when you were little?" Sasuke did not answer, eyes upon the brush-like hair that touched Itaka's tall neck, molded according to graceful proportions. The child in him that loved myths would agreeably liken it to the elegant temple tower, which reached up for the storm, that stood erect in the Kasai lands his mother spoke of. His older sibling was like a prince in fair tales women cherished and men revered. That part of him was much like their mother's, his brother had more of her in him than he ever did, and a part of him, which had begun from childhood and grown together with his body, resented that. Silent. "You should not be that angry," Itaka spoke and placed the brush into the ink pot and looked to him again. Now, when he turned to Sasuke, a little light accentuated a crimson decoration about his neck and shoulders. It looked as if he was about to bleed out from the wound that had opened up in his breast. "You should not be angry with me. You know I cannot bear it," Itaka spoke, his voice sweetly whispering, stroking his cheek, turning the caress into patting lightly as though Sasuke were a little naughty child who had done something he did not approve of, but he loved him too much to punish him. Itaka drew his hand back, his fingers elongating, tapering off to daggers on the wall, a well-drawn scene from a folk tale meant to frighten children. His shadow was more honest by being a true display of his mien. When memories came, so did the precise sort of unpleasantness that was enough to make him feel as though he was slowly growing ill. Liar. Thief. Daemon. The kabuki theater actor part he played, and he pinpointed the act's acuity without rushing through the mannerisms. Sasuke hated it. He had seen through him, and he would not be put to sleep anymore. With Sasuke's resolve made, the glimmer in his eyes, replaced by a ghoulish elation that only a child could get away with. Itake, his foe in a goodly fell, sat quietly whilst he gazed upon the letter he had finished writing moments ago. It came as no surprise that many compared his wildness, presented in all its blunt honesty on his person, to his sibling's pristine mien. He was a frozen man who had learnt the art of walking unchanging, bull-headed, selfish, wrapped up in a motley of black and white. Sasuke felt savaged by his own tendency to be too trusting of his tricks. He was always immaculately well dressed. He had to be, with his little job as Leaf's shepherd, loyalty and blindness his adornments. He had too many sheep, rather dogs, to guide, and he had guided many on his mentor's orders. His lord, Ieyasu, whose most cherished word was dogs. Itaka spoke, yet he did not listen, for he spoke like a poetic militant whose mercy was only accident. Perhaps the enduring martyr was one that was never born, yet invented. It was a strange sentiment, his heart overawed by the honesty of which he had never thought, and whence it had come. All was quiet as love. Sasuke did not dwell more on the thought, rose to his feet, went to sleep. That night, whilst the room harbored his fears like ghosts wandering in graveyards, his thoughts had not raged like storms in many years. No, they had located a sense of peace in the resignation from his heart that was meant to bear the dead's burdens. When morning came, he was awakened by the rain outside. It was soft and light. He looked on the right and found his brother fast asleep. He lay prone, neck straight, hands on his breast. He always looked as though he was about to be interred into a lonely grave. About the room, light that was grey glowed through mist, and when he blinked, yellow invaded the walls. Sasuke sighed. In what seemed like a moment, he had overslept much to his own dismay. Itaka sat by the low table. The ink in the scroll had dried up, the fire in the lantern, eaten through the oil overnight. A faint odor of its aging paper existed in the air, but the rain's smell, grape-scented, which came from the vines outside, was too overpowering for it to gain any strength. He looked to Sasuke as he sat up, his hair messy than the night before. "The storm is sleeping. We should leave now, Itaka spoke and smiled as Suzuki's head bowed from fatigue, eyes closing, for these little games had tired out the child. He wanted to sleep some more. He was a sweet boy, but like all children who wanted to play all the time, he did not possess boundless energy. It was for the best if he kept dragging the boy along, a simpler method to prevent the little one from playing any more mean tricks. Go and wash your face, he spoke, watching as an expression of annoyance became visible on Suzuki's face. I can make you tea if you want. The younger one said nothing and left the room. Itaki rolled up the scroll and rose to his feet and went outside. It was still raining, and, by the house's corners, purple lilies had awoken, even though it was their time to sleep. They had grown to maturity overnight, delighted at the child's presence in their midst. Playfully, they laughed, swinging back and forth through mist. Itaki exhaled a long foggy breath. He would have to suppress the child's chakra, for a common chakra suppression seal and poison would hinder it no longer. Somehow. He looked on the right to the kudzu vine that had overtaken the house under its ceaseless growth. Its rampant branches that coiled and twined about one another had created a natural roof atop the wooden one. He could no longer see the roof underneath. Now, it was off running to the south, climbing onto trees, sprouting fresh stems. He could see few portions that still bore reddish-purple flowers, but the purple lilies. They had escaped its wrath, fought it off, eaten up their share of the territory. Itaka was still gazing upon the purple lilies when Suzuki came out of the house, trying to wear the jonin jacket as though he was battling with it, a curiosity in his face upon seeing the look of interest in his older brother's eyes. He turned his eyes to the lilies, too, that looked restless without wind. Then he looked up at his brother in whose eyes he saw a hint of uneasiness, though it vanished easily than nightly ghosts. A smile returned to Itaka's face and he walked to him, straightened his jonin jacket, and locked the house with the traditional padlock and hand seals their father had taught them. Curious, Suzuki knelt by the purple lilies, and, overjoyed, their petals vibrated. He smiled, watching sunlight slide into the rain droplets that stood on their petals, for he had never seen them do that. It was the strangest thing. He wanted to touch them, but, before he could, Itaka spoke, "Come, Suzuki. The storm is returning. If we do not leave now, we would have to stay here for another night." Sighing, Suzuki got to his feet and followed his brother. They walked on the broken pathway that led to the trail many traders used. It was just outside this part of the forest that had begun to speak against the storm, for it was returning fast, its wind blowing at them from the back, a jumble of scents hitting their senses. When Suzuki reached the trail, which was flanked by trees overreaching overhead, he saw his brother walking into the silhouettes in a sturdy oxen-drawn wagon, fitted with 6 wooden wheels rattling over every stone and crack in the trail, heading east. A little weary, he jogged and slipped into the wagon, over which a waterproof canvas was stretched. The old man who led the wagon looked back to him, a straw hat slouching low over his eyes, a smoking pipe between his teeth. He mumbled something like, "Pesky young UNS." At the sight of Suzuki's too innocent smile and looked ahead. He thought that the jonin jacket Suzuki wore was for make-believe playing, not a genuine article of military clothing, and he was old, and his sight was failing, and Suzuki's face was too boylike that most that did not know of his temper, nature, and age were graciously fooled. Suzuki sat like this for a moment, swaying, mischievously waiting for his brother to give up the thought of walking all the way back to leave and climb in. Not a moment later, the wagon rattled and his quiet brother climbed into the wagon, too, and the old man looked back and then forward again, mumbling about, "Fathers bad as their apples. And, they have, young, but never teach, young uns a darn thing. And, control ya peckers. Though." He had said the last bit out loud. Suzuki, smiling now, stayed silent. He had not spoken a word to Itaka since their little quarrel at Iyasu's house. Itaka, looking to Suzuki, watched as he fished out a red sasanqua from his pocket. He had probably plucked it before he left Iyasu's house. He twirled it in his fingers, red blushing across his lips and cheeks like summer's fires. Itaki removed his gaze from upon his sibling and looked at the meeting point of the mounts and forests that trembled in storm's haze. Itaki, he that wept out illusions into the child's eyes, knew of the fruitless end to the child's journey, a child who thought of the closure in a world that had none. This meadow was quiet, flowers stood singing. Up above, sun lay in sky's depth, an unusual nugget of gold, no longer bold, and at sky's far end, a storm was coming this way, and with it, it would bring forth trouble. Oh, trouble, 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 he was like trouble, existed like her dream's bubble. If only she could cause mischief in his heart, too, a little trouble that was true. Rays, bloodless arrowheads, came down to her, went deep into her breast, and made shadows flee from their nest, come at her with spite in their hearts. Yellowed by autumn's indifference, lost spring leaves danced on her thighs as shadows. She sat with her back against a big tree, its boughs leaning down and forward. How time flies! She thought, eyes on the meadow that did not hum together with summer's breeze and herald a change this land coveted. Back in those days, spring would come from the soil, sky, air, it was everywhere. Now, leaf was being caused to sob by autumn's continual fury, and, when it wept hard, and from its tears grew purple lilies that took perverse joys in its miseries. What a spiteful child, he did not know when to stay put. Autumn began early and lasted long, too long for leaf to find joy again. Everything was grey and joyless, all the more so for a good spring that was but a memory. Breeze blew in her direction, her hair whipping, boughs hissing out. Sky lost a little of its sunny yellow, and it would welcome gloom that caused it worry. Strange. Maybe she and the sky were alike. It was during summer days that she would sit here, with Naruto by her side, under the tree's shade, intense gray against happy yellow. They would reminisce about the old days, sleeping and awaking beside the river that flowed by the meadow, never leaving. Naruto, he had grown sweet on her when he was a boy, running, tripping, jumping senselessly through yellow poppies in summer, smiling. When she went with him to the sunning meadows, sometimes, she found it hard to find him when he played hide and seek, squatted amongst the many yellow smiling faces, bobbing on stalks, lithe and pretty like her legs, as he would say to her. Sun rays, he would say, had bubbles and joys in them. He was silly like that, though she never had the heart to tell him that she would only come over on days Suzuki would. She truly did not have the heart. Though still a boy of 12, Suzuki was like a painting come alive. He, after much entreaties from Naruto, would come over to the meadow, silhouetted against the sky, and she could not help but smile that he had come, he had finally come. She had seen him once before when he was 10, sleeping in his brother's lap, head leaning against his breast. There was a shadow that had settled across the upper half of the older brother, and it touched the little brother, too, though the right side of his face was still white, sweetened by hearth's warmth, and visible to her gaze, and she had smiled, pinked in the cheeks, placed her chin in application scroll on the table of the older brother, who now ruled much of Leaf. He had dismissed her, hand resting on his sibling's back. She wanted to ask the younger brother's name, but the older brother. He made her afraid, so she left his office and ran down the street that was quiet at night, rain shining on the stones, water splashing from her footfalls, happy. She did not remember what she had said to her mother then, it was so long ago, but why did it feel as though it were yesterday? Mother tells me that some memories are like the sun. They never leave. Naruto had said to her, his smile no less radiant than sun. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps. Memories were dreams, which slept in sleep's womb, which birthed them nightly. What a burden! To her, memories, dreams, too, were like spring that was leaving, chasing autumn, never truly catching hold of its fragments. They were near yet far, connected by summer that linked them to each other but held them apart. Summer stood between spring and autumn, stood between them, stood between her and him. That was what she thought when she was 16, and he, 12. The girl in her never grew, stubborn, but memories mattered to girls, not women. She closed her eyes, breeze going through her hair, wondering. Things changed, yet they had the power to remain just the same, yet he grew, and he was just the same. How terrible for women that their dreams remained the same, too, a thought that was true. Rising to her feet, she felt the wetness enclosed in wind, concealing a change, brought rain from the underbelly of clouds, throwing light-washed droplets at the forest and her. Upon the grass, light sparkled inside rain, and earth's scent ran like untamed children about her. Like the sun, she whispered, a smile on her lips, and ran through the grass that was tall and wet and yellow. It hissed, sneaking serpents slithering, slapped against her legs, but she was overjoyed, transported down memory's pathways that existed suspended between dream and reality, existed between them truly. The river moved slowly, its waves long and languid, unhurried, and here, the grass was short, tickling against her ankles, almost crunchy like barley biscuits. Bunching her hands, she kept running, eyes wearing autumn's rain, a love letter, tearing through mist that called upon autumn from north's deep. Where are you now if not lost? No, I'm not lost. Gasping, she lost her footing and crashed down to the grass, falling, tumbling, rolling. She finally stopped moving, lying face up, looking into the storm that was still moving. Rain that was still coming. It was a drizzle for now, soft and pleasant and kind, spring-like. Like flurrying curtains, light moved over her, yellow, gray, white. Everything was changing, yet nothing changed between them. Nothing. Light shrunk about her, constricted from all sides, till the little storm eye was closed, and then it rained loud, and it rained hard. The storm began to hit at her, its strikes cruel and precise. The droplets where they struck formed wet flowers on impact. She was shivering now, aching in the belly. The hurting pain was back, and it made her want him again, want him more, and now she bled out from the place that had opened and let out liquid black in long streams. And this time, she did not weep clear tears, no, her eyes gave out blood that pinked as rain filled up her eyes. She should have been frightened, but she was not, dreaming with eyes open, wanting with heart broken. She heard humming and turned her head and saw child Naruto sleeping on her right, a smile sleeping on his lips like summer poppies did inside earth. Then she looked on her left, and there he was, curving into her in the way that his charm was demonic, indifferent, unforgiving, not unlike autumn, uncaring of spring's gifts. From the seam of his trembling lips grew the purple lily's bud that sought out the moon, and he was young 12, she imagined, sleeping like darling children, dreaming deeply. Up in the sky, moon came upon night and released its lights, and the bud that came from his lips grew, yet so did he, to the handsomest man in the world, with the most beautifully formed countenance, limbs, and torso, and when he grew to the state in which she saw him now, the lily's petals unfurled to the full, sighing. And lilies, many of them, grew out from his veins, their stems, hair-like, running beside his blood like elixir. It was not fair to be so close, yet so far, and autumn moth's larvae wriggled free from the soil to feed upon the blood that flowed from him in thin and graceful gushes. Soon, they were turning, becoming sinister, growing out to be winter's moths, devil's moths, the sharing an eyes on their wings glowing, warning, threatening, and they were all looking upon her, snuffing out her life slice by slice. Their reds went deep into her spirit, splintered its fabric, enchanted her soul. The older one was less fair than the little one, after all. And they rushed to her, and, beneath her skin, hungry larvae bit at her. Unsatisfied by her bitter blood, though they continued to bite away at her flesh out of habit and hunger, they trembled towards his sleeping form. She quivered all over, aching, unable to get up. At last, she screamed when she saw a shiny one squirming into her right eye and broke free of them, squishing many in the process, and devil's moths that had matured in winter's air flew in a feverish rabble up above. Rubbing at her eyes, she sniffled, weeping. In the wind, breaths sang, and she looked up at a white tree reaching tall and bowing low to the youth sleeping by her side. When its flower opened wide, inside it was a big red eye with rings many that looked upon him as though he were its child. A flower shivering at the lips, he slept as peacefully as a babe. Curiously in love, she bent over him and plucked the flower from his lips, and disconnected from the soil of his flesh, blood bubbled at the lips seam, and first they were red like the flower's eye, and then they were child pink against rain, spring's memory in autumn. And his mouth opened a little, and he drew in the air deeply as though he meant to breathe in all of autumn all at once. He never had been a patient one. Pink, spreading over his throat, disappeared, yet shadow of tree and moth remained, and she kissed him, for he was distressfully tempting, and poppies slept long and sound, their summer now dreams. Then her flesh wriggled free like the larvae, twitchy, and she sat astride his flesh. Stars his eye, rain his hands, snakes unfolding, invading, pouring inside. It was a dream, a fairy tale of a prince she loved as a child, yet her body was afire, grieving, and, soon, she saw fires burning red, struggling underneath her skin, and her mouth opened wide and she sang arias from her heart, and then she was ash, floating. What are you doing here? I told you to wait by the tree, a voice spoke, and she opened her eyes and saw a man against the sun's twinkle, a sun that was less warm. With the dream soaring like ash, she sat up and looked at him. I was tired of waiting, Toshiro, she said and wiped her rain-soaked eyes clean. Do I have to tell you everything? What is that? You're bleeding again. Toshiro asked, surprised, looking at the black liquid that remained stuck to her thighs. You might want to get that looked at. There was a little mud here. It's nothing, she said and swiftly rose to her feet and looked at him. Though Toshiro was hiding a smile, he looked sober, hairs of the lightest yellow like the sun. Mud, huh? That don't look like mud to me, he said, amused. It looks like you shat inside your underwear. It's right. This job ain't easy. I'm not judging. Fuck you, she muttered and walked away from him. The long walk from the forest, whilst dreadful, was better than the sense-throttling damp of Danzo's sanctuary. If you could call it that. She did not know what he was expecting from her. At such a gumo, he enjoyed dwelling in his burrow, tricking fools with his strings. No one came. Danzo asked, and she could almost hear a little surprise in his voice. No, Toshiro replied, his cat mask in place, as though he was hiding his face from the daemon he himself had summoned. A talisman to ward it off. In the dirty light, his faded yellow hairs shone brightly, which still had rain in them. Danzo breathed out roughly, clicked his stick against the wood that was older than he, and looked at her. Then he was silent, almost observant. Did you send in your Jonin application, Sakura? He asked her, his voice rougher than last time. I did, but Sakura stopped and inhaled the dirt-scented air that smelt unpleasant, smelt of him. It's no good till Suzuki doesn't approve it. Feisty little boy, he spoke in a long gasp, and Sakura and Toshiro stole a glance at one another. What of the Umbu contract? I did ask Hitaka-sama to give me the medic's place, the one that died. He didn't say anything. He told me to get an approval from Tsunade-sama and Suzuki. My hands are tied. I can't do anything, she said and took a moment to look at the old walls the light barely affected. You have grown. Easy, he spoke, and his voice, though frail, had a threatening edge to it that she did not miss. I'm trying, but Tsunade-sama isn't making it easy. She. Have you worked on the seal? At least, tell me you have been doing that duty, as you cannot seem to manage anything else, he spoke, a derision in his voice that she did not like, but, as always, she did not talk back. Sakura nodded, eyes upon the old man whose furrows called upon the gathering of shadows more effectively than this room's nooks and corners. He truly had grown quite old. Against the storm that came at the house, young and brutal and powerful. Would it leave here with his old head, sleep smiling in its bed? Vengeance, family, honor, delightful things boys' fairy tales were made of. He's growing ill. It's not working. That's not what you promised me, she said, bravely, though her voice was still whispering, telling of the terror she felt. Why are you young and a fool? A cliché. Danzo asked, letting out words from between his compressed teeth, though she felt as though he worded it like a statement, not a question. It will work. I need Minato on my side. What better way to do this than to free his son from this burden leave placed on him? He will come around and then I will have the strength to oust Ieyasu's dog from the council. Silence. Sakura heard his breaths, rough upon the air, and saw the white ghosts they left in the dark as they disappeared. By her side, Toshiro had not spoken a word, though he never spoke out of turn. She never asked where he was from, probably a Yamanaka stray like Fu that Danzo had plucked from the orphanage. He liked his orphans to be naive and young boys. Suzuki knows about the tunnels. I can't use them anymore, she said, drawing a bit of his bright eyes' attention for a moment too long. I don't know how he found out, but he's been sniffing around the forest looking for them. I think he knows everything about them. Maybe Itaki. He did not tell the boy anything. Danzo spoke, his voice blaring a little in the cozy little room, and rose up to his feet. You forget that he is Leaf's commander. The tunnels were built to keep a watch on the Uchiha. He has known. He has always known about them. They were built before my time. Tobirama-sama. He never trusted the clan, so he got them built. They kept the clan in line, but they grew suspicious and planned a coup. A coup? But I don't. She stopped, shocked, wide green eyes collecting more light, shining in her face. Did Sasuke know of his clan's treachery? That is what ended them. He spoke and walked to the window and looked at the rain pressing against the glass in clear gray sheets. After the massacre, they promised that no man in their clan would ever possess a Sharingan powerful enough to tame the daemon, but they cannot be trusted, can they? The boy exists, and Itachi protects him. He was never the way he is now. He has disappointed me. Lightning twined about the darkness and sky burnt like the living, dying in white lights, and for once, she was quite afraid. For herself. And then when Danzo said nothing, she left his house, walking swiftly through the storm that was beating at her. Terrified of what was to come, she ran into the forest where rain was thin and trees grew grim and stopped, her breast heaving fast. She did not know when the tears joined the rain on her face, but they did. Sakura heard the crunch of steps behind her back, and she knew who it was. Toshiro, leave off. She shouted, even though she did not mean to. I came here to tell you that Danzo-sama isn't happy. He wants you to try harder, Toshiro said, standing by the tree, looking up at the storm that was passing off to join the one that was distressing Leaf. Sakura straightened her back and looked at his face. His mask was off, revealing a face that was young and pleasant to the eyes. Are you smarting on me? She asked, breaths hissing from her lips. I didn't know anything about the coup, and now he tells me? Sage, damn it. I can't stop Sasuke, can't stop a man who's out to get even. I can't stop Itachi. I'm being crushed between your wars. I can't do this anymore. I'm telling you what he told me, he said and looked down at her and smiled. I didn't come out here in the rain after you cause I like you. No, I came cause I had no choice. So why don't you do as you're told and stop bullshitting? I'd make my job a lot easier. Angered, she hurled a fist at his head. To her surprise, he was far more swift than she had imagined, for he had slipped under her arm and flashed back before she could blink. That did not lessen her anger, no, it fired it up tenfold. Why don't you suck my cock? She burst out, hands knotted like iron clumps, quaking. Kami, you're an unpleasant cunt, Toshiro said calmly and brushed the rain droplets from his glove-covered arms. You think there's a way out? There isn't any, and I think, deep down, you know that, too, or maybe not that deep down. You thought you could just come laughing into root for whatever petty reason and up and leave? You stupid bitch. There's no way out. There's never any in the villages. You either enjoy your stay, or you get put down, so enjoy your stay and don't forget to smile. Nobody likes a killjoy. Then Toshiro smiled fully, turned, and left her alone in the forest's cloistered night, and, up above, Leaf's sky was still burning, dying, fighting against the storm that would see it turning to ash evermore. A change in Uchiha leadership. Tsunade repeated his words, her lips almost giving away her amusement. Itachi isn't my business. Your clan isn't my business. Why are you here? Tell me. You know why. The land's lease is ending soon, Yamato began, and Tsunade held her breath, for it was loud within and without. Their ownership will go over to Sasuke. Fugaku-sama's will. And we both know the boy doesn't like Leaf. Itachi would. He's a little sensitive when it comes to Sasuke, he cut across her, lightning shining upon the side of his face that was exposed to the window. He won't force him. He'd try, but he won't force him to hand it over to you. Tsunade leaned back into the large chair, whose shadow was smaller on the wall behind her, and entwined her sweaty fingers together. What are you suggesting? Should I have the boy killed and invite Itachi's anger? Should I hold him hostage and invite Itachi's anger? What should I do? Because no matter what I do to the boy, Itachi would be angry, and I don't want him to be angry, Tsunade said, her voice surprisingly cool despite the uncertainty that occupied the air like a ghost in its jagged teeth. I can get you the proof you need from the boy, Yamato said slowly, and his voice was a whisper to Tsunade's ears. What proof? She asked, impatient, her heart like thunders. Torun's and Fu's murders. Unpleasant business. I'm sure their families might want justice, he said, smiling earnestly, his teeth shining like silver coins against the light. That'd be enough to remove Itaka from his seats, both of them. The clan won't take the news well, and I'm sure that your council will be upset by his lies. Tsunade did not say anything. Think she needed time to think. Once he's removed from power, we can control the lands together, Leaf and the Uchiha. That was always Fugaku-sama's dream, Kami bless him, he said, and then he was silent, looking at the shards that sparkled on the floor when the sky burnt in the midst of white fires. Itaka. He is Ieyasu's favorite boy, Tsunade began and wiped clean the sake droplets from the table, with her fingertips. I think, your ambitions are loftier than they should be. She moved her hand a little in a circular motion, unamused. A man should aim for stars, Yamato said, his smile gentle but restrained. She could tell that he had much on his mind, though he chose little to share. Tsunade looked at him, her gaze penetrating, still, reflecting Lantern's light. Not every man should, she said at length, observing him. But every man could, he shot back, quickly. Tsunade let out a gasp-like sound of amusement and pushed the unused scroll aside to make room for her elbows. You want me to butt my head with this country's most powerful councilman? She asked and widened her eyes and smile, her teeth showing. And over what your wish to take Itaka's place? Are you out of your sage-damned mind? Not a coin goes through Leaf without Ieyasu's blessings. The whole country eats out of his hands. The boy says okay? He's a nuisance. A pest. I want him gone, but if it means that I'd invite more than I bargained for, I can tolerate him. You should, too. The lands will go to Ieyasu, Yamato spoke, a peculiar shine in his eyes which did not leave in spite of the softening lantern's light. Itaka will make sure of it. If not completely, a joint ownership to tease the daimyo. Leaf will be cut off from them forever. Your medicines, crops, ninjutsu, everything you can think of, Ieyasu would control it. He'd choke up Leaf's lifeline and it'd dry out in months. Next it'd be your seat. He might do away with Leaf altogether. Are you prepared for a cutthroat bureaucrat to strangle the life out of this village, your grandfather's dream? Tsunade did not speak, her mind raging faster than torrential rivers in summer. And what about Danzo? Wasn't he his father's favorite first? He continued and stood up, his shadow falling heavily in front of him, upon her. Once the lease ends, you won't have time to think. Make your choice. And then he was gone. And Leaf wept, hiccuping, fretting, regretting, and joyful he arrived, his older sibling in his wake. There was a happiness in the way the little one moved, storm guiding his steps to bring forth more trouble. Moon bled from the yawning cut in sky's breast, what a time to be young and alive. The Uchiha village was slumbering, blinking in night's retreat. Lanterns that hung outside closed doors discharged dampened reds, yellows, whites onto the air, and it wore them upon itself the way a demure bride wore its garments. The stream went tumbling, mumbling, bubbling down the winding road, never stopping, carrying silvers the moon gave night's gifts. Their house that stood under a leaning tree and its stooping shadow loomed into view, and the older sibling noticed that the little one's walk turned faster as though he was a babe returning home, delighted by the prospect of gifts after a festival. He was in half a mind to ask Suzuki to walk slowly, but before he could, Suzuki turned to the garden and disappeared inside the house. Tanaka stopped him at the gate and told him of Tsunade's arrival an hour ago. The lands. He knew, but she could wait. He asked the aged servant to go to sleep as the night was cold and long, and then he stepped into the light that was less welcoming than the last time he left here. Itaka looked down the corridor, and, a moment later, Suzuki came from his room, mischief-causing scrolls stuffed into his pockets like children's tricks, no doubt. Suzuki, do not go outside at this hour. A storm is coming. Itaka stopped as Suzuki left through the main door in silence. This way. Letting out a long breath, Itaka wiped his hands across his face. Then he heard creaky, energetic steps come towards him and a voice said, Itaka-sama, Suzuki left. Should I stop? I noticed. Itaka cut across him, irked. Go home, Sarizawa. Your wife and child must miss you dearly. It is late, and I am weary. With that, he left his subordinate in the corridor and heard him leave some moments later. When Itaka opened the library door, a smell of incense fled the room. Tanaka had left open the sliding door that led to the garden. Outside, leaves scraped against the house's roof, took wind's burden upon themselves. He placed the sword back on the sword rack and settled down by the table and looked upon the brazier that was cold as the rain outside. Closing his eyes, he leaned his head against the wall. The rain was still falling, plashing on stones, ringing. It would be a long night. Occupied by a restlessness that he had not known in a long time. Sleep. He wanted to sleep. The nerves were tight, throbbing in his temples. The child had begun a new game, but he was too drowsy to give chase tonight. Let him play at the end. Children grew tired of it all, too. The door of his father's library opened a crack that let the corridor's light in, and, before the sound stopped, Itaki opened his eyes and gazed upon a woman that stood in shadows. "You have come." She spoke, her voice's age battling against its youthful joy. "I was worried." Rao spoke, smiled, settled down beside the brazier out of habit, but, in the darkness, he could scarcely see her smile. "Why are you still awake? You should be sleeping." He spoke and looked away to the garden that invited his gaze. "Sarizawa received your letter, and Rao paused, her smile growing uncertain. "I wanted to see you before I went to sleep." To her dismay, Itaka said nothing, eyes upon the trees that stood blackly against night's territory. "I made a mistake, but Suzuki is back and your anger is, too." She spoke, her tone tender as spring trees, and lowered her eyes to look at the soot that existed in the brazier and rubbed her hands together in aggressive slow motion. "I should not have made a mistake, but I did. I want you to forgive me. Your anger is hurtful. I did what I thought was best for you. I do not know why you think I am against you, but you should not." Then she said no more, her continued gaze pressing upon the ash as though she was hoping to bring forth something to life from its cold caressed remains. "He would not have come back had it not been his intention to cause mischief," Itaka spoke, looking outside at the dark and heavy mist that existed in the midst of rain's continued burble. "I know Suzuki. I can see the mischief in his eyes. It is there. A pretty little sparkle that makes him look more innocent." Then Itaka stood up and looked at her, and she, him. "You want me to forgive you?" "I forgive you, but does my forgiveness mend what you have broken?" Itaki asked, casting a gaze of frigid apathy upon her. "I do not think it does, so does it matter if I forgive you or not?" "It does not matter, and for that, I forgive you, Oba-san." Then Itaka left the room, and wind from outside blew at the ashes and tossed them on the floor, and she closed her eyes and saw stars through the anguish in her eyes. It was a lonely time to be young and alive. This house was a mad dog, and all it took was great joy in biting her. It nipped at her heels and feasted on her meat and chomped away on her bones, dramatic, but half true. There were days when sky would look so blue, outlined against the billowing clouds, not a star in sight. Summer skies had an energetic blue, a smiling sun, clear nights. Rains were sparse, and storms did not come till summer's fall, but autumn was different. It wept all day long, and its nights were wet and strong. In those nights, of which she spoke to no soul, she rid her womb of summer's remains. It was a cure she had got from Miyuki, and it helped her live for another night her own little vengeance. Back then, her palm would stretch over the womb's beating core, feel the heart that was young, see the spirit that had sprung. Then her hands would run with blood, a babe, collapsed into the womb, lost. Days and nights it was all the same whilst she travelled upon indented grass and trampled ground all day. Sometimes, she would run out into the dark, knowing that no one would come for her, and spend her night by the trees that slept in peace, dreaming. Yet she felt good for the graves she dug out in her belly, one after the other. How many had perished, a woe in the blues of her darling. He cared more for them than he ever did for her. Okasan, Okasan. She would weep, guilty, but she dreamt, too, in peace. In Yomi's cracks, a blood pool awaited her, and in night's clotting gloom, she would be terror-struck by what she had done, for her children should have died on Kami's time, not man's, not mother's. Then day would come amidst a pearl of stream and curl of sky, dawning through autumn's fog, and she would forget the children. For another night. Now, it was a creaking dog that bit her hard and slow and long. Sitting by the fire, she had grown used to its angers, her children forgotten reveries. She pulled in a trembling breath, looking upon the things that stood before their shadows, watching, and in the midst of storm's rising breeze, she heard a knock come upon the door. Lonely, she smiled, for she had not seen a soul out here in days, and when she opened the main door, her joy knew no bounds. Kami had listened to her prayers that night, and there he stood, lithe and lovely at the door. "Suzuki," she let out the whisper and, without thinking, hurled herself at him, took him in an embrace that was crushing, her blood and veins beating in pairs, warming. She did not let go, hair floating about her in the night breeze whose fragrance was less enchanting than his. "I thought I should check up on you, but you're happy," Suzuki remarked and looked down at her and smiled. "You look like you missed me." Like a besotted young girl, Hinata nodded, touched his cheek, kissed his lips. "I missed you," Hinata admitted, joy flowing from her reflecting eyes. "You're like a little girl," he said, backed away, and sat down on the wooden threshold, looking out at the moors lost in darkness and sounds of waving grass that never left. Hinata sat down by his side and leaned her head against his shoulder. He was quiet, looking, waiting for something, but, out there in the forest, no one was waiting for him. She began and could say no more, words finding solace alongside her children in autumn's charming sepulchres. "It's nice out here," Suzuki said, crossed his legs, breathed out a loud breath that curled in white tendrils towards his countenance before it vanished. "Quite peaceful. No one to bother you." Hinata sat up straight and gazed at the sunny side of his aspect, affected by the lantern that was hung above them. She did not know what to say, but she smiled for he was here, for she was happy, for her heart was overjoyed. "I'd ask Niji to train you," he spoke again, not looking at her but the forest that was cursed in her eyes. "If you learn something, Ida and Isama would have no reason to throw you out. I'd talk to Naruto, too. He needs to. He freed me," she said, suddenly, and that got his full attention. "What?" he asked and shrank his eyes and lost his endearing smile, a confusion coming into his features with slowness. "Naruto freed me," Hinata said again, took hold of his hand, kissed his fingers. "I'm free, Suzuki. I'm free." And she saw red wriggle onto his eyes, obscured by a stranger emotion. It took a moment for them to resume their delicate black richness. "When?" he asked, a fresh smile maturing upon his lips, though it was not as sweet as the one he showed to her before. "Some days ago," she said, shy. "I waited for you to come, but you didn't." With a burdened sigh, Suzuki directed his eyes back to the forest, and ripened by autumn, its scent was lovely. Mounted upon night's wings, darkness fed on the land with its delicate proboscis, sucked up shades, left promises of a whiter morn that would bloom inside autumn's shelter. The air about them was night-warmed and mild, and with Suzuki by her side, she thought that the scene was fragrant and agreeable. Restless to speak with him, Hinata turned her face to him and said, "What's wrong? Are you angry?" "What, no," Suzuki said, shaking his head once in absent-mindedness. "Why would you say that?" Then the smile returned to his lips and brightened his visage, but his gaze did not return upon her. "We should run away?" Hinata asked, out of the blue, and fixed on him her round grey eyes. Suzuki laughed softly and looked upon her as though he was looking upon a naive little girl. "Where?" he asked, smiling fully. "Anywhere." She burst out, red like a juicy apple's bottom. "You know," he began, leaning forward, feigning soberness, "Obasan always says that that's like running away from trouble rather than taking it by the horns." And he made a light fist of his hand and shook it a bit. "She does this fist thing, often. Turns red in the face crazy." "We can hide from trouble," she insisted, straightening down her hair, blowing at stray ones that blocked her vision. "But trouble always finds me," he said, playful. "Then." She paused, her words staying in the air like low-ringing sounds. "Then we can go somewhere else." "But then we'd run out of places to hide," he said, enjoying her silliness. "You're no fun," she said, pouting her lips which she had painted with a common flower color, which was taken from the light pink ones, which peddlers grew in pots. "I know," he said and emitted a pleasant laughter and looked at her out of the corner of his eyes as if he was still playing. "Tell you what, you go and find me a good place to hide, and we'd think about running." Hinata nodded, happy, and he went back to peering into the forest as though it was his long-lost mother that he had not seen in years. Wanting all of his attention tonight, she tapped on his shoulder and said, "I made something for you," and smiled a big smile and pulled a folded scroll paper from her obi. "Wait!" Hinata yelled and snatched the paper from his hand. "Oh, no, not this one. Come inside. Come, come." She grabbed hold of his hand and pulled him into the house and locked it from the inside. Then she took him to her room where half-finished paintings lay scattered on the floor by a lantern, whose light made richer the wet paints, and beamed up at him. "Ah, Renegan. For me?" he asked and tapped her little nose with his fingertip. "No one's ever made a painting for me. Well, Oto-sama liked painting, but I don't think he painted anything for me." "You like it?" she asked, standing by his shadow, which the lantern had cast. "When you give it to me, I'd keep it close to my heart," he said, tapped lightly his breast where his heart was, winked. Hinata emitted a short, shy, girl-like laugh and lowered her eyes that wore blacks upon grays more intensely. "I should." "No, stay." She protested, held fast to his hand that was warmer than hers, twisted her lips in worry. "You don't come often." "Stay. I'd have to go to Oto-sama's again. I'd be stuck there, won't be able to see you again for days. You can't keep doing this. If you want to stay in the squad, you'd." "I can't. I have to go. It's our memory reading festival," she said, enclosing her hand on his. "What?" he asked, mind chasing again the thread it had lost. It's like a look into the eyes, you know," she said, widening her eyes as though he did not understand, inviting him to look into hers. "We look into the byakugans of the men who've died, record their memories, and say our prayers. We do this every year." "Every year?" he asked, unaware that his lips were moving, lungs were working, his mind was in another realm now, leeching off the images his Sherry-non was seeing, laving. Hinata nodded. "The head families only. The cursed seal of you know." Her voice trailed off like dots on an unfinished missive, and she then said nothing. Outside, lightning awoke the storm, and it came to life with a new vigor. It was easier before her words, now, it was the loveliest meal. "Stay, please," Hinata said again, her words softer, caressing his hand, and he took one look at her lust-ripened eyes and he thought it all to be a true treat. Ah, there was no rest for the children when they got out to get even. Twining spines, a lull bookended by frenetic slices of ardor, piquant pleasures of autumn gush, gush, gush. Rainwater on stones trembled from underneath light, rippling uncertainly onwards, netted by golds. It was the deepest parts of night when he directed his steps to the library. In his age, reading Uchiha folk tales brought him great joy. He heard his mother's rough breaths as he passed by her door, lantern in hand, but he did not stop. The library and its lights awaited him, and when he opened the door, he was greeted by an interplay of brightness and dullness about the racks, which contained many scrolls. He placed the lantern by the low table and turned towards the rack that had the scroll he needed, and that was when he felt his presence behind his back. "It is rude to steal into someone's house," he spoke, took out the scroll, turned to look upon him. "What would your brother say, Suzuki?" "I didn't want to disturb your mother, Nomura-san," Suzuki said and took a step to come into the light that was radiant. He was smiling, a pleasant smile, though Nomura could see the unmistakable twinkle of mischief in his eyes. Nomura looked at him up and down and spoke, "You are soaking wet. Were you out in the storm all night? You should go home. It is cold. A storm rages outside. We can talk tomorrow." "This can't wait," Suzuki spoke, the tone of his voice approaching dangerously close to a hiss, and his impatience brought forth Sherry-nons from his bleak black steeps, placing vibrant joys in their centers. Nomura pushed his hands into his sleeves, watching, listening, lending his ears to all that he could hear. "What cannot wait, child?" he asked, straightened his spine. "I need a seat in the Uchiha Council, and you'd help me get it," Suzuki said in a soft voice and sat down by the burning hearth and leaned forward. Nomura did not know what to say. Check the description for the links to the author.